The member for Solomon has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer please update the House on how Australia is successfully transitioning from the mining investment boom to a more diversified economy? Is the Treasurer aware of any alternate plans that would damage the national budget and hinder efforts to grow the economy and jobs?
Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank Member Solomon for her question. In our country's north, she is well aware of the great opportunities that we have in this country to continue to grow our economy, to support growth and jobs going forward, Mr Speaker. We know, as the Prime Minister said, these are exciting times, but they're also uncertain times globally. And at times like this, Mr Speaker, we need to acknowledge that, understand them and frame our policies to ensure that we can give Australians continued confidence in the growth and jobs of the future. Now, what is happening in our economy, Mr Speaker, is it is transitioning, and that is good news. Despite the very serious global headwinds, our economy is transitioning, and it's Australians out there who are making that transition from the investment phase of the mining boom to the more broad and more diversified economy. And it's Australians who are doing it every day, Mr Speaker, and that's why this government is so focused on trying to back those Australians in who are making those decisions every day, working, saving and investing. Now, that transition story is backed up today by comments by the Reserve Bank Governor, who has said in his announcement on rates today, in Australia the available information suggests that the expansion in the non-mining parts of the economy strengthened during 2015, even as the contraction in spending in mining investment continued. Surveys of business conditions moved to above average levels. Employment growth picked up and the unemployment rate declined in the second half of the year, even though measured GDP growth was still below average. The pace of lending to business also picked up. Last year, over 300,000 jobs. Retail sales up, Mr Speaker. What we are seeing is an Australian economy that is growing at twice the rate of the comparable economies like Canada, for example, which also has a commodities base. So despite those headwinds, our economy, Mr Speaker, is moving forward and it is transitioning. Now, what we did prior to the end of last year, Mr Speaker, is release the mid-year statement. And in that mid-year statement, we released a very sober and honest assessment of the fact that growth will continue into the future, but it will be a difficult challenge as we go forward, Mr Speaker. And we had sensible budget forecasts in there that realised that growth will continue, but at the same time, to ensure the integrity of the budget, we need to continue to get expenditure under control. And expenditure is falling as a percentage of GDP over the budget and forward estimates from 25.9% to 25.3%. Now, you need to continue to control expenditure to keep the budget on the right path. Now, those opposite, Mr Speaker, do not want to go down that path. What they are doing, Mr Speaker, is they want to tax higher to spend more. You cannot have lower taxes in this country if you want to spend more. The best guarantee against higher taxes is lower spending, Mr Speaker, and in these uncertain financial times globally, now is not the time to go down the tax, spend and borrow path that those excelled in while in government, Mr Speaker, and wish to bring back to the Treasury benches. So this government will focus on controlling expenditure and supporting growth and jobs.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I rise today to speak to the Broadcasting Legislation Amendment Bill, which has its focus on stripping away some of the red tape that has been applied to digital radio transmission since its rollout in this country back in 2009. It's fair to say, I think, that the digital radio is yet to capture the hearts and minds of radio listeners in the same way as, say, the introduction of FM radio did in the 1970s, which significantly impacted on listeners' habits. As I'll talk about in a minute, Solomon, and indeed the Northern Territory as a whole, is yet to get digital services almost 7 years after their introduction in the 5 mainland state capitals. That said, I don't see a strong groundswell in customer demand for the service, which suggests to me radio audiences are generally happy with the existing analogue AM/FM services. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, the technology is out there, and I'm extremely hopeful that as a consequence of this bill, digital radio will be coming to Darwin and Palmerston in the not-too-distant future. Having said that, I'm also aware that the rollout of digital radio should be driven by the market, and the role of government in this space is to provide the regulatory regime to allow this to take place. And this is why the Turnbull government is hoping to achieve, or what the Turnbull government is hoping to achieve with the Broadcasting Legislation Amendment Bill. Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, Adelaide and Perth have had digital radio services for some years, and while Canberra and Darwin have had trials, we still don't have regular digital radio services in our home or our car radios. Of course, national services such as the ABC's music-oriented Double J are available digitally and even via our digital television, but Darwin does not have the extra capacity that a localised digital service can deliver. As it now stands, the Northern Territory has a vibrant radio sector that caters to our remote communities in some of our regional towns, Alice Springs, and as I said, the two cities, Darwin and Palmerston, both of which are in my electorate of Solomon. I'll provide a quick rundown of these services by way of illustrating the strength of the commercial community and public broadcast sectors in Solomon, bearing in mind the combined population of Darwin, Palmerston and the rural area is approximately 130,000. Music enthusiasts in the top end are well catered for through the Grant Broadcasters Hot 100, as well as the dance techno station Kick FM. In addition to music, Hot also has a commitment to local news and broadcasts local and national bulletins throughout the day. Hot's sister station, Mix FM, provides, as its name suggests, a mix of current affairs and music. The station was rocked last year by the far too early death of one of its leading lights, Pete Davies, who I'm sure that many people have come across him in this house. They certainly locked horns with him on issues affecting Territorians, particularly things that he was most passionate about, and one of those was health services. A respected former Territory politician, Daryl Manzies, fronts the morning microphone on Territory FM, a community radio station based out of Charles Darwin University. The station is broadcast on 104.1 in Darwin and Palmerston and 98.7 Alice Springs. It can also be heard across the Territory in Batchelor, Katherine, Tyndall and Tennant Creek, Nhulunbuy and Adelaide River, and as far as community radio goes, is regarded as having one of the biggest audience reaches per capita in the country. ABC Local Radio runs a primarily talk-based format, but also spins plenty of tunes, and the national broadcaster footprint in Darwin and the Territory also includes News Radio, RN and Classic FM. Remelt provides faith-based radio, and Darwin is also host to the excellent Larrakia Radio, which first broadcast back in 1998 and now provides content in over 40 Indigenous languages. I'll dwell for a few moments on Larrakia Radio, which operates in Kavanagh Street in the Darwin City's Central Business District and also broadcasts national Aboriginal radio, which reaches Indigenous communities right across the country. Its operators recognised some years ago that digital radio was coming and converted from analogue to digital technology. The only part of Larrakia Radio and national Aboriginal radio that isn't digital is the transmitter. This means its thousands of listeners around the Northern Territory's top end are still tuning in on analogue receivers. In addition to the news and entertainment functions they perform, all radio stations in the Territory provide emergency warning in the event of impending cyclones, flood threats or fire threats. So as it stands, there is no shortage of existing radio stations in Solomon, but as Darwin and Palmerston continues to grow, so too will the demand for expanded radio services. There is plenty of scope for the rollout of digital services when the time is right. So now to the nitty-gritty of the bill, which amends in one fell swoop the Broadcasting Services Act and the Radio Communications Act, and is, as I said earlier, is designed to reduce regulatory complexity and simplify the planning and licensing of digital radio in regional Australia. The bill specifically includes repealing the restricted data casting licence category, removes the role of the Minister in the setting of the digital startup day for each regional licence area. It removes the requirement for a 6-year moratorium on the allocation of additional digital commercial radio broadcasting licences in a licence area following the commencement of digital radio services in that area. It amends the definition of non-foundation digital radio multiplex transmitter licences and it makes some minor amendments to the Broadcasting Services Act and Radio Communications Act to repeal spent digital radio provisions. As I said earlier, digital radio services commenced in the 5 mainland state capitals in 2009, and I think I'm correct in saying there was an expectation that the rollout of additional services outside these main centres would follow in turn. Some 7 years later, this has not been the case. In fact, the intervening period, the only digital radio services that have been provided in regional areas were trial services, as I said, in Canberra and Darwin. Digital radio was introduced in a staged manner, which broadcasters first providing digital radio services in areas that were most likely to be commercially viable. So the changes we are discussing today reflect a need to streamline and refine the current arrangements to create a simpler process that the Turnbull Government believes will facilitate the rollout of digital radio services in regional Australia. Much of the content of this amendment legislation will be contained in the Government's digital radio report, which considered the regulatory framework for digital radio as well as arrangements to facilitate the rollout services in regional areas. A key finding of the report was that digital radio will continue as a supplementary rather than a replacement technology for the short to medium term. This means there are no plans to switch off the existing and analogue AM and FM services, which should provide an incentive to the existing operators to contemplate a digital future. This recognises the importance of ongoing provisions of local news and local emergency services information by these radio services. The digital radio report also found that it is primarily a commercial decision for broadcasters as to whether they should extend their digital radio services to regional licensed areas. The Government considers that broadcasters are best placed to make these decisions about which services are likely to be commercially viable. The report recommended that industry members and the Australian Communications and Media Authority establish a digital radio planning committee for regional Australia to focus on the rollout of digital radio to regional areas where it is commercially viable to do so. The committee has now been established, and I'm pleased to say it's currently giving priority to the licensing of permanent digital radio station services or digital radio services in Darwin as well as Canberra. In answer to the question, will digital radio be available in my region? I say this. The Government considers that the broadcasting industry is best placed to identify regional markets that could support a commercially viable digital radio service. On that basis, I encourage residents in regional markets such as those found in Solomon to discuss the provision of digital radio with the local broadcasters. In other recommendations, the report also urged that the digital radio moratorium period be removed for regional licences and that the restricted data casting licence category be removed to simplify the digital radio regime because no licences had so far been issued under this category. Another of its recommendations was that the Government consider minor amendments to the current digital radio regulatory regime to provide a simpler, more flexible process for planning and licensing digital radio in Australia. As I said earlier, the Turnbull Government considers that the broadcasters and radio listeners are in the best position to determine the most appropriate mix of digital radio services for their listeners, and that the proposed amendments do not impose any restrictions on the content that can be provided. The precedent set in the mainland state capitals suggests that the new digital-only services have provided listeners with more specialised music and information services than they were previously available. It's the view of the Government that removing the Minister's gatekeeper role will simplify the arrangements related to the planning of digital radio services in regional licence areas and make them more consistent with other broadcasting services. This is consistent with the Turnbull Government's view that ACMA is best placed to decide when and where the rollout of digital radio services into regional Australia should occur. It will also remove unnecessary government intervention in the commencement of digital radio services in those areas. So, to summarise it all, what these amendments will do is change the landscape of digital radio regulation in Australia in line with what we know, 6 years after the first digital radio stations commenced operations in the 5 state mainland capitals. It's the Government's view that the provisions contained here are overwhelmingly positive and is plainly obvious, with amendments such as removal of the Minister's intervention role that they are focused on unshackling the digital sector for the benefit of all Australians. From a personal point of view, I'm happy with ACMA that will be actively giving Darwin priority when it comes to the licensing of permanent digital radio services, and I urge local analogue operators to work with the community in coming months and years to make this happen. So with that, Mr Deputy Speaker, I commend the bill to the House.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the honourable member for Solomon.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I rise to give my support to the Migration Amendment Complementary Protection and Other Measures Bill, which my colleague and friend, the Minister for Immigration, tabled in the House late last year, and which in some ways rounds off the legislative journey to stop people smuggling that began almost 3 years ago when the Coalition Government was elected to government. The issue of illegal boat arrivals bewildered the previous Labor government and shone a spotlight on its incompetence and incapacity to deal with the big issues that affected Australians. After Labor's reprehensible decision to kill off the Pacific solution, the floodgates of unauthorised vessels opened up, with quite literally tens of thousands of illegal arrivals making their way to Australia. First and foremost, the journey of these people was absolutely extraordinarily dangerous and put at risk not only the lives of those on board, but also the safety of the Navy personnel charged with trying to save them when their boats hit troubled waters off our northwest coast. Estimates of how many died at sea are, by their very nature, imprecise, but it's anywhere between 1,300 and 2,000 estimated over a 5-year period. It's never been properly explained why Labor killed off the Pacific solution. I guess it's impossible to explain a move that was so short-sighted, so lacking in judgment, and as bereft of good sense as to be almost beyond comprehension. But that's what the previous Labor government did. It killed off a policy that was extremely successful and replaced it with, nothing. I suppose it's sheer genius from those opposite. Labor's policy sent a message to people smugglers that they were able to resume their human trafficking trade into Australia that had effectively ended in 2001. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, let me provide you with some figures that show the extent of the previous Labor government's stupidity in this space. In 1998, according to figures from the Parliamentary Library, 200 people arrived in Australia by unauthorised boat. The following year, that was 3,721 unauthorised boat arrivals. In 2000, there was 2,839 people arrived, and in 2001, the year the Pacific solution was introduced, 5,516 people arrived by unauthorised boat. And then something remarkable happened. Directly as a result of offshore processing and the Pacific solution, the flow of unauthorised boat arrivals slowly slowed down to a very slight trickle. In 2002, there was 1. The following year, 53. The next year, 15, then 11, then 60. We then saw the election of Kevin Rudd and Labor, and then numbers increased to 148, 161, 2,726, and that was in 2009, 6,555 in 2010, 4,565 in 2011, 17,204 in 2012, and 20,587 in 2013. By any measure, an unconscionable policy failed that, through clear-sighted policy implementation, took the Coalition Government less than 12 months to turn this around. Since July 2014, there has not been one single successful unauthorised boat arrival in Australia. Operation Sovereign Borders has been an unmitigated legislative success. This is in stark contrast to the opposition's policy blunders. Our clear-sighted vision to stop the boats, to stop the terrible tragedies in Australia's northern waters. This has put an end to the ambiguities and mixed messages the people smugglers took from the Labor Party's incoherency. The Coalition's policies aren't just about boat turnbacks and shortcomings, the people smugglers business model. They are multifaceted and involving and continually evolving, and this will ensure they continue to meet the challenges that arise now and into the future of maintaining a strong border protection regime, which brings us to the bill we are debating today. The Migration Amendment, Complementary Protection and Other Measures Bills follows on from the passage of the 2014 Legacy Act and the 2015 Migration Amendment, Protection and Other Measurements Act. In his second reading speech, the Immigration Minister described the Complementary Protection and Other Measures Bill as the final instalment in a package of legislative reforms that implements the government's election commitments to ensure a more effective and efficient onshore protection status determination process. The measures in this bill are a continuation of the government's protection reform agenda, which are delivering a more effective and efficient onshore protection status determination process. The bill will amend the statutory framework within the 1958 Migration Act in so much as it relates to the determination process for people seeking protection on complementary protection grounds as distinct from the refugee framework in the Migration Act. To explain this in context in which this is framed, I found an extremely informative study online from the University of New South Wales which backgrounds migration protection measures and the reasons why they are part of Australia's migration regime. It explains that since March 2012, asylum seekers processed in Australia have been able to claim protection on broader grounds than those contained in the Refugee Convention, reflecting Australia's obligation under international human rights law. These obligations are the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhumane or Degrading Treatment or Punishment and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Since 2012, Australian law has been aligned with comparable provisions in the European Union, Canada, the United States, New Zealand, Hong Kong and Mexico, as well as refugee systems in Latin America and Africa. The University of New South Wales says that the measures, and I quote, introduce greater efficiency, transparency and accountability into Australia's protection regime. Prior to March 2012, Australia was unable to guarantee that people who did not meet the refugee definition in the Refugee Convention, but who nonetheless face serious human rights abuses if returned to their country of origin or habitual residence, would be granted protection. A refugee is defined as someone with a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, political opinion or membership of a particular social group. However, as a person may face the prospect of serious human rights violations in their country of origin but not satisfy the definition of a refugee. This may occur, for example, if the harm they face is not for one of the 5 Refugee Convention grounds. The complementary protection describes as a category of protection for people who are not refugees, but who also cannot be returned to their country of origin, as there is a real risk they would suffer significant harm that would engage one of the obligations I referred to earlier. The amendments in this legislation will align the statutory complementary protection framework with the statutory refugee framework as inserted by the Legacy Act in 2014. Without these amendments, there is an inconsistency between the two frameworks in the Migration Act. Under the current protection visa process, a person may not meet one of the elements of the refugee test relating to internal relocation alternatives, effective protection or behaviour modifications. However, they may satisfy the complementary protection test because those same elements are currently not aligned. By closely aligning the statutory complementary protection and refugee frameworks in the Migration Act, the bill will restore the government's intended interpretation of Australia's complementary protection obligations. This is necessary to ensure that, consistent with Australia's international obligations, only those who are in need of Australia's protection will be eligible for a protection visa on a complementary protection grounds. The technical amendments in the bill will ensure that the existing provisions in the Migration Act work as originally intended. They will not change the substance of the amended provisions. The bill clarifies the interpretation of various concepts in the Migration Act used to determine whether a person will face a real risk of significant harm, so as to give rise to a non-return obligations under the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhumane or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, or the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. This is necessary as there have been instances of several people having been found to meet the complementary protection criteria on a wide variety of grounds. Some of the examples given included selling adult movies and drinking or supplying alcohol in countries which punished those activities, despite the fact that the government, consistent with our international obligations, did not intend for such cases to be covered by the legislation. There have also been several people who have met the complementary protection criteria where they have been involved in serious crimes in their home countries or are fleeing their home countries due to their association with criminal gangs. So specifically, Mr Deputy Speaker, the bill will provide that a real risk of significant harm to a person must relate to all areas of the receiving country. It clarifies that a person must face a personal risk of significant harm in the receiving country rather than a risk that is purely indiscriminate. The bill clarifies that a person will not face a real risk of significant harm if effective protection measures are available to the person through state or non-state actors in the receiving country, and it clarifies that a person can take reasonable steps to modify their behaviour so as to avoid significant harm, does not face a real risk of that harm as necessary and foreseeable consequences of their removal to a receiving country, provided that the behaviour modification would not conflict with their identity or core belief system. As I said, the technical amendments in the bill will clarify the reference to protection obligations in the Act by specifying the source of the obligations and clarify that the country referred to in subsection 5H1, which outlines the meaning of refugee, is intended to be the same country as the receiving country in subsection 5-1. It will align the statutory provisions relating to protection in other countries with the definition of well-founded fear of persecution in subsection 5J of the Act and amend subsection 36(2)(c) to remove duplication between paragraphs 36(2)(c)(b) and subsection 36(1)(c) in the Act, which both operate to exclude an applicant for the grant of a protection visa on character-related grounds. So in addition, it will amend subsections 336F5, which authorise disclosure of identifying information to foreign countries to include information pertaining to unauthorised maritime arrivals who make claims of protection as a refugee and fall within the circumstances of subsection 36(1)(c) of the Act. Beyond that, it will also amend subsection 502(1), which allows the Minister for Immigration and Border Protection to personally make a decision that is not reviewable by the Administrative Appeals Tribunal to apply to persons who have been refused a protection visa on complementary protection grounds for reasons relating to the character of that person. And finally, it will amend subsection 503(1), which relates to the exclusion of certain people from Australia to apply to people who have been refused the grant of a protection visa on complementary protection grounds for reasons relating to the character of the person. All quite reasonable in my view. And so with that, I commend the bill to the House.
The question now is that the amendment be agreed to, so I call the honourable member for Solomon.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. During the course of this debate, it is important not to forget the symbiotic relationship between the Australian Union movement and that it has with the Australian Labor Party, and the depths to which the ALP will stoop to keep their union masters happy. We've seen since the release of the Commission's finding a campaign by the Labor Party to attack the report's credibility, and we just heard an example of that then with the previous speaker. But it's also to attack the credibility and the integrity of one of Australia's best regarded legal minds in Commissioner Dyson Hayden. Labor's behaviour has been atrocious, and its defence of the union thuggery outlined in the Royal Commission shines a light on the ALP's rotten core. The Labor Party doesn't want to see the building unions or any other union reformed because that would undermine its power base and the rivers of cash that flow from the union movement to the Labor Party year after year. In the Northern Territory, the ties between the unions and Labor were spectacularly exposed last year with the release of a Commission of Inquiry report into the extremely dodgy handover of a former seafarers' shelter known as the Stella Maris that overlooks Darwin Harbour, only minutes from the CBD. The previous Territory Labor government, instead of going through a proper managed community consultation process, they actually gifted on the eve of the 2012 election this wonderful site to Unions NT, their union mates. Now, unsurprisingly, when this was discovered by the incoming Country Liberal government, an inquiry into exactly what took place convened. It was presided over by John Lawler, who has a 35-year history in law enforcement in the country, including 4 years as CEO of the Australian Crime Commission. The findings were unambiguously bad for the Territory Labor Party and for Unions NT, but their default position was to attack Commissioner Lawler's because of, as I said, because he had negative findings against them, and so they took it about on him. However, repercussions from the inquiry eventually forced the resignation of the Labor Party's opposition leader, Delia Laurie, and her deputy leader during the time, Jerry McCarthy, who was up to his neck in it, remains still tarnished by the event today. What the Commission showed was that the Labor Party was prepared to compromise hard-working Territory public servants, the Territory public service as a whole, and ignore the interests of the broader community just so it could pander to and do favours for its union mates. I think that behaviour is absolutely disgraceful. And I'd like to take the opportunity to put on record in this House some of the findings on the Stella Maris Commission of Inquiry. The findings stated that on July the 10th, 2012, a Cabinet submission number 4033, the future of Stella Maris site, lot 5260, town of Darwin, went to the Northern Territory Cabinet for consideration. The submission was considered by only 4 of the 8 Cabinet ministers. A decision was made to offer a Crown lease term over to the site to the Unions NT without an expression of interest process. The decision was against the strong and considered advice of the broader public sector not to grant the site to any community group without following an expression of interest process. Despite the fact he was sponsoring the submission, the Minister for Lands and Planning at the time, Gerald McCarthy, was absent from the meeting. Following the meeting, the department was advised of the Cabinet decision and began drafting the lease conditions and letter of offer for Minister McCarthy to sign and send to Unions NT to meet his ministerial responsibilities under the Crown Law Act. It's clear that prior to and immediately following the Cabinet meeting, the department had little to no information about what Unions NT intended to do with the site. The department believed that there was an expectation to make the lease offer before the pre-election government caretaker period commencing on the 6th of August 2012, and given the official Cabinet direction, acted with undue haste in processing Union NT's flawed community land grant application. This led to the department breaching its own processes for dealing with community land grants. The grant application for the department processed was inaccurate, 3 years out of date, and did not document Unions NT's true intentions for the site. The department should have made the minister aware of exactly what the community land grant process had not been followed. The lease conditions and letter of offer were prepared and stamped with Minister McCarthy's signature on the 3rd of August 2012, the last working day before the caretaker period. No public information was provided during the process, causing a public information blackout. Commissioner Lawler then scrutinised the role of individuals and groups involved in this dodgy deal, starting with the Labor Cabinet. He said of the Cabinet, it's difficult to understand how the Cabinet ministers could have reasonably rejected the advice in the Cabinet submission to have an open and transparent expression of interest process and proceed to approve the proposal to grant a Crown lease exclusively to Unions NT based on one paragraph in the submission which included a warning about potential criticism in pursuing that option. The starting point should have been a process that called for more transparency, not less, and complete adherence to the long-standing community land grant process. Unfortunately, the opposite occurred. He said of Minister McCarthy, his decision was arguably unreasonable and, if challenged in court, would be susceptible to being overturned. It was unreasonable because he did not have the necessary information to justify selectively choosing Unions NT over any other group. He said further of Minister McCarthy that he did not act with accountability, responsibility, or with proper consideration of those likely to be affected by his decision, namely the numerous community groups that had expressed interest in the site over a long period of time. He went on to say there was no public advertisement, no media release, and no way of the public to know of the decision until a notice was published in the Government Gazette on the 26th of September 2012. The public information blackout deprived members of the public of their entitlement to know that Minister McCarthy had made a decision and the reasons why the decision had been made. He went on to say that having considered all the factors in relation to the decision to propose the grant to the lease of the Unions NT for the site, Minister McCarthy's conduct was not accountable, not reasonable, and not in the public interest. He said of Minister Laurie, she acted with bias and over many years, forming a view in 2009 that Unions NT should be exclusively granted a lease over the site without an expression of interest process. He further said that Minister Laurie should have made it clear to the department that it was her intention to grant the site to the Unions NT without an expression of interest process. Minister Laurie may have genuinely believed that granting the site exclusively to Unions NT was in the public's interest. The way she involved herself in the process was not proper and was unfair to the public and other community groups. He said of Unions NT, the application submitted to both Minister Laurie and Minister McCarthy on behalf of the Unions NT did not have a proper factual basis. It was misleading and exaggerated the history between Unions NT and the site. The Unions NT executive failed in its responsibility to ensure the application submitted on its behalf to the ministers was of a high standard and had reflected its true intentions for the site. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, there's plenty more, but with my limited time, I've placed on record some of the important details that I think that needed to be put on record that outline the deal between Unions NT and the NT Labor. So back to the bill. As many of my colleagues have rightly pointed out, the construction industry provides many jobs for workers in small businesses, large enterprises and contractors. Now, my dad spent many years in the construction industry and by all accounts was a highly skilled tradesman, as was his father. The industry is critical to a productive, prosperous and internationally competitive Australia, and we on this side recognise the importance of an industry that is vital to job creation and essential to Australia's economic and social well-being. The bill we are debating today re-establishes the Australian Building and Construction Commission, a genuinely strong watchdog that will maintain the rule of law to protect workers and constructors and improve productivity on building sites and construction projects, whether onshore or offshore. If passed, the bill will reverse Labor's changes to the laws which underpinned the Australian Building and Construction Commission before it was abolished in 2012. Importantly, if passed, the bill prohibits unlawful industrial action, unlawful picketing and coercion and discrimination. Penalties that are high enough to provide an effective deterrent will apply to breaches of these provisions. A wide range of effective remedies such as injunctions will also be available to the ABCC and persons affected by unlawful behaviour. The case to re-establish the ABCC is clear. For many years, the building and construction sector provided the worst examples of industrial relations lawlessness. Going back to 2001, when a Royal Commission into the building and construction industry found compelling evidence of the need to reform this industry. And many examples of evidence of how building sites and construction projects in Australia were hotbeds for intimidation, for lawlessness, for thuggery and for violence. Projects were delayed, costs blew out, and investment in our economy and infrastructure was being jeopardised. Central to the Royal Commission's finding was industry lawlessness. It concluded that the standard of commercial and industrial conduct exhibited in the building and construction industry represented a significant departure from that in the rest of the Australian economy. Witnesses' reports reported criminal conduct, unlawful and inappropriate conduct, including breaches of the relevant workplace relations and work health and safety legislation and a disregard for Commonwealth and state revenue statutes. Inappropriate conduct was defined by the Royal Commission as behaviour that infringes the Workplace Relations Act in 1996, a person's right of choice or other conduct which departs from recognised norms of civility and behaviour. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, while the ABCC existed, the economic and industrial performance of the building and construction industry significantly improved. For example, a 2013 independent economics report on the state of the sector during the period found that building and construction productivity grew by more than 9% and that consumers were better off by around $7.5 billion annually, and very importantly, fewer working days were lost through industrial action. Now, we know what happened, but I'll just remind you, Mr Deputy Speaker, that the former Labor government came under sustained pressure from building and construction unions to abolish the ABCC and the building code that supported its work. The Labor government procrastinated for 5 years, but before the Workplace Relations Minister, who was Bill Shorten at the time, gave in to the union demands and abolished the organisation in 2012 and replaced it with a regulator with significantly reduced funding and powers. This saw the bad old days return: wildcat stoppages, militant protests, demands from unions and their mates were being employed on projects ahead of non-union people or non-union members, and an increase in construction industry disputes to a 7-year high. Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, I think the case is pretty clear as to why we should do that. The main objective of the bill is to provide an improved workplace relations framework for building and construction work to ensure that this is carried out fairly, efficiently and productively for the benefit of all building industry participants and for the benefit of the Australian economy as a whole. The bill aims to improve the bargaining framework so as to further encourage genuine bargaining at the workplace level. Enterprise bargaining and negotiations must be harmonious, sensible and productive, and should be tailored to the particular workplace. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, the Coalition Government is committed to doing all that is necessary to reform the building and construction industry and to reinstate the rule of law in this sector. We on this side wholeheartedly believe that workers deserve to be able to go to work each day without the fear of being harassed, intimidated or the subject of violence. The former Labor government undermined confidence in the building and construction industry. Abolishing the ABCC has seen a return to lawlessness and an increase in the number of days where work is simply not being done in the industry. Australia cannot afford to have a building and construction industry which is inefficient and unstable. The restoration of the ABCC and the code which supports its work is critical for the reform of Australia. The contents of this bill reflect this commitment. So with that, Mr Deputy Speaker, I commend the bill to the House.
Government business, order of the day number 1, Competition and Consumer Amendment Payment Surcharges Bill 2015, resumption of debate on the second reading.
The member for Solomon.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And the response to the government's plan to curb excessive credit card fees has been broad, considered and overwhelmingly positive. I'd like to spend some time going through some of the commentary that followed the Prime Minister's announcement last October that the government would act on disproportionate card surcharges. Under the headline Plan to Rein in Excessive Surcharges on Plan Payments, John Collett in Fairfax pointed to widespread community frustration at the current free-for-all fees regime. It's a common trap, he wrote on October 25 last year. Consumers are seduced by the headline price of an airfare or concert ticket only to find themselves slugged with a hefty booking fee for the privilege of paying with a credit card or debit card. The price of convenience is an astonishing $1.6 billion a year. That's how much Australians pay in surcharges for card payments, according to a survey commissioned by MasterCard last year. If you think it's too much, you're not alone. Consumer organisation Choice has been rallying against excessive surcharges for years, while a Change.org petition calling on Jetstar to drop its surcharge of $17 for a return fare has collected around 110,000 signatures to date. Now we finally meet some action, John Collett writes. The Turnbull Government, as part of a broader response to an inquiry into the financial system, announced last week it would crack down on excessive surcharges. The Government announced it would legislate a ban on surcharges that exceeds the reasonable cost faced by merchants in accepting cards. The move is likely to have bipartisan support, so it's going to happen. It's a question of when and what it will mean in practice. He says no one disputes that there is some cost to the merchants of accepting cards. The question is, what is the reasonable cost? Choice has estimated that MasterCard or Visa transactions cost around 1% of the transaction total to process, while Amex and diner clubs are more expensive, up to 2%. He continues, Choice has described Qantas and its low-cost offshoot Jetstar and cab charge as among the worst offenders in excessive surcharging of their customers. I'll deal with the question of what is a reasonable cost later in my speech, but Collett goes on to detail in his article some of the excessive costs. He says Virgin Australia charges $7.70 a ticket, whether paid by credit card, debit card or PayPal. The surcharge can amount to up to about 8% on top of the typical cost of a flight from Sydney to Melbourne. Qantas charges $2.50 for payment for domestic tickets, which includes New Zealand paid by debit card. It charges $7 for domestic tickets paid by credit card. For international tickets, the surcharge is $30 by credit card and $10 by debit card. Other media outlets mirrored the positive line taken by Fairfax. Online newspaper The Guardian wrote on the 20th of October under the headline, Turnbull Government to crack down on excessive credit card surcharges. The government has agreed to take action to improve fee and surcharging arrangements for credit card transactions, which could reduce the costs faced by consumers when they buy products at shops and restaurants. News.com also on the 20th of October headlined its article, Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull declares an end to credit card gouging. It wrote, one of the most frustrating shopping experiences will soon be a thing of the past as the Australian Government flags an end to unfair credit card surcharges. Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull has declared that the fee charged at the cash register for using a credit card must be no more than the merchant's cost of processing the transaction, typically a mere 0.5%. They said many retailers charged at least double this amount, and in extreme cases the surcharge can be as much as 20 times higher in practice, which has infuriated many customers. Treasurer Scott Morrison said that the credit card surcharges have to pass the fair dinkum test. It's a sign that something desperately needed to be done to curb credit card fee gouging that media was virtually 100% behind the government's actions. The survey referred to earlier was initiated by Claus Bartosh and, as of late last night, had collected 110,855 signatures. That and responses to David Murray's Financial System Inquiry report, where 5,000 submissions out of 6,500 related to the surcharge, signal a win for people power and the collective will over dodgy business practices. While this legislation sets out to put an end to fee gouging, the government acknowledges the need for businesses to recoup fees accrued from customer credit card payments. If you like I did, through credit card surcharges has been around forever, then think again. As a point of history, it is interesting to note that credit card surcharges were only introduced in Australia back in 2004. An article on online news magazine The Conversation said that in 2003 the Reserve Bank of Australia introduced a series of payment system reforms, including the elimination of the pre-existing no surcharge rules. This meant that retailers could recover the cost of accepting a credit card from the customer who chose to use the card. What the Reserve Bank failed to do was to limit the size of the surcharge the retailer could set. So not surprisingly, given the success of surcharges in Australia, the RBA rules have been followed all around the world. The Conversation makes a strong case for the retention of credit card surcharges, but at a rate commensurate with the cost to the retailer of taking the credit card payment. Credit cards, it says, are relatively expensive payment tools when compared to other card forms such as debit cards and, of course, cash. Under a no surcharge rule, it follows that there would be an excessive use of credit cards because of their popularity with the consumers and that they are very easy to use. So it makes sense that customers would choose to use a credit card because the cost would be shared at the price point by people who paid cash or used debit cards. This excessive use would further jack up costs for businesses, which would in turn be passed on to consumers. It's a vicious retail circle. While this shared cost would benefit the credit card user, it would be patently unfair for non-credit card consumers. Surcharging changes this by levelling a fee on the credit card user rather than unfairly spreading to all customers. But as it is now clear, it's the level of the fee that has become of such concern for potentially millions of Australians who make purchases with their credit cards. The Murray Inquiry recommendation was simple and succinct. Recommendation 17 said government should, and I quote, improving surcharge regulation by expanding its application and ensuring customers using lower cost payment methods cannot be over-surcharged by allowing more prescriptive limits on surcharging. So in other words, protect the credit card user from businesses that take too large a cut from the credit card transaction while also protecting the consumer who doesn't pay by credit card. And this is exactly the balance the government has sought in this legislation that we are debating today. The Competition and Consumer Amendment Payment Surcharge Bill was introduced by the Assistant Treasurer during 2015's final parliamentary sittings with the very clear objective of limiting surcharges to no more than to cost recovery or the cost to the business of the transaction fee. Contained within the second reading speech was an extraordinary set of figures, and I'd like to share that with you. Each month, around $45 billion in purchases are processed in Australia through more than 500 million card transactions. And it doesn't take much imagination to realise the possible scope of saving by shutting down what the Assistant Treasurer referred to as the widespread problem of excessive surcharging. This measure, in other words, will provide considerable savings overall to Australian consumers. The laws will be given enforcement muscle with the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission responsible for enforcing this ban to ensure consumers are treated fairly. The Reserve Bank of Australia will play a key role in setting the costs that a merchant is permitted to recover by surcharging. A few problem industries such as ticketing, airline and travel industries have created most of the consumer complaints and distorted price signals in the payment system. The enforcement muscle I spoke of a moment ago comes in the form of heavy fines to businesses who seek to profit from consumers who pay with credit cards. The ACCC will be able to require merchants and other payment system participants to provide documents or information to help it assess the costs incurred against any surcharges imposed by that merchant. It will be an offence to fail to provide the documents or information requested by the ACCC. If the ACCC forms the view that a merchant has engaged in excessive surcharging, it may be an infringement notice, including a penalty for listed corporations of up to 600 penalty units, currently $108,000 for each alleged contravention. This bill will set alongside other existing legislation designed to protect consumers from dodgy business practices. Australian consumer law requires that pricing is communicated to consumers in a manner that is not misleading or deceptive and which allows businesses to compete on a level playing field. The ACL sets out the prices presented to customers must state that the total price of the good or service at a single figure, with the total price to be displayed at least as prominently at any part price. This ensures that consumers can easily compare the prices of different goods and services. Drip pricing is where a headline price is advertised at the beginning of an online purchase and additional fees and charges which may be unavoidable for consumers are incrementally disclosed. On 17th of November 2015, in action pursued by the ACCC, the Federal Court found that Jetstar and Virgin Australia had in some specific instances engaged in drip pricing through misleading and deceptive conduct and making false or misleading representation about the price of a particular advertised airfare. In October 2014, Ticketek and Ticketmaster adjusted their pricing practices in response to concerns raised by the ACCC regarding drip pricing. In April 2015, media reports suggested that Audi had not adequately disclosed surcharges to customers at some stores despite adjusting their disclosure practices in 2014 after concerns raised by ASIC in relation to their powers regarding misleading and deceptive conduct in the provision of financial services. So, Mr Speaker, these are the practices the government hopes to stamp out with the passage of this bill. Addressing excessive card surcharging is a priority for the Turnbull government, and this is reflected in the speed with which these measures have come before Parliament since the release of our response to the financial system. So with that, Mr Speaker, I commend the bill to the House.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the honourable member for Solomon.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I too rise to speak on the Australian Crime Commission Amendment National Policing Information Bill 2015. Mr Deputy Speaker, as you know, my husband Paul is a police officer of some 30 plus years, and I know firsthand how hard he and his 1,400 or so colleagues work to ensure the safety and security of the cities, towns and the communities right across the Northern Territory. And I'm reassured that the coalition government, under the stewardship of the member for Stirling and the Minister for Justice, is using its legislative powers to improve policing outcomes and law enforcement capabilities in the face of the ever-evolving crime threat in this country. The measures being debated today will see the Australian Crime Commission and CrimTrack merged into a single entry with the goal of improving productivity and effectiveness as both an operational and an administrative level. CrimTrack contributes to Australia's crime-fighting effort by facilitating information sharing between police agencies across the state and territory borders. The Australian Crime Commission began its operations in 2003 with a broad remit to combat serious and organised crimes such as corruption, terrorism, drug-related activities and, indeed, money laundering. It works with local enforcement agencies and has recently had some success tapping into the insidious trade of the drug ice in the Northern Territory and, indeed, nationally, which I will talk about in more detail soon. CrimTrack has its origins back in July 2000 with the signing of an intergovernmental agreement by representatives from all states and territories, and it was 10 years earlier, in March 1990, that the Commonwealth, the 6 states and the Northern Territory entered into an agreement concerning the national exchange of police information, commonly known as National Common Police Services, formerly known as the NEPI Agreement, and I was working in the IT section at the Northern Territory Police around this time, and so remember very clearly the discussions that were being had around this particular agreement and how excited many members were. The intergovernmental agreement identified CrimTrack in coming years would include a national automated fingerprint identification system, a national DNA criminal investigation system, and the Northern Territory Police, its forensic unit, was actually leading the way in terms of its DNA and was recording a lot of the DNA long before other states, and I've got to say they were actually leading the area around DNA recollection. A national child sex offender system, and that's something that George Christensen and I are very keen about, is having a national sex offender register that would be made public, but there's a lot of work to go before that gets to that stage. The purpose of the Australian Crime Commission Amendment, the National Policing Information Bill, and the Australian Crime Commission National Policing Information Charges Bill 2015 is to bring CrimTrack and the Australian Crime Commission together under one banner. The legislation is intended to implement last year's decision by the Law, Crime and Community Safety Council that the Commonwealth will take steps to implement a merger between the two agencies. This merger brings together Australia's national criminal intelligence and information capabilities. A unified resource of this type will value add law enforcement's national understanding of criminal activity and allow police, justice agencies and policymakers at all levels of government to adopt a more effective, efficient and evidence-based response to crime. Under the proposed merger, CrimTrack will carry its functions over to the ACC, providing national coordinated criminal history checks. The CrimTrack Board of Management and the position of CrimTrack's CEO will be abolished, but the merged agency will continue to carry out all of CrimTrack's functions, which are referred to as National Policing Information Functions under the merged agency structure. The merger will broaden the remit and functions of the ACC board and ensure that states and territories have the capacity to retain control over board decisions should the composition of the ACC board change over time. It will set out the constitutional basis for the merged agency's new policing information functions and enable the merged agency to charge a fee for goods or services that it provides in the course of performing its national policing information functions, as CrimTrack currently does. The legislation will preserve the current CrimTrack funding model, which allows charges for certain services to support the provisions of national policing information systems and services to police at no cost to the Australian Government. CrimTrack, it should be pointed out, is entirely self-funded through revenue generated primarily from criminal history checks. It will also broaden the types of duties a state or territory law may impose on the merged agency to include other duties relating to the merged agency's national policing information functions and place limits on the Crime Commission's CEO's ability to disclose national policing information to non-board agencies as currently applied to CrimTrack. It will enable the ACC CEO to disclose national coordinated criminal history checks to an accredited agency or the individual that is subject to the check, and continue the National Police Information Systems and Services special account. The merger will be cost neutral, and small savings are expected over the forward estimates. The ACC has reached right across Australia, and in September last year was involved in a joint initiative with the Northern Territory Police, the Australian Federal Police and the Australian Border Force, as well as the Australian Crime Commission, in a major drug bust in Darwin. And this was all part of Task Force Nemesis. 2 women were charged following an operation that focused on the trafficking of methamphetamine into the Territory. The operation showcased the benefits of agencies working together and the collaborative capacities of the nation's law enforcement agencies. In the sting, a 46-year-old woman who was found with 500 grams of ice concealed in chocolate wrappers was charged with supplying a commercial quantity of methamphetamine, possessing a commercial quantity of methamphetamine, and possessing an implement to administer a dangerous drug. Another woman attempted to board a flight from Darwin to Sydney, was located with $55,000 in her possession, and a search on her home in suburban Palmerston, which is where I live, located 165 grams of ice. She was charged with drugs, property and conspiracy charges. Following these arrests, New South Wales Police executed a search warrant at a residence in Sydney and seized 1,000 grams of substance suspected of being ice. In the Northern Territory, as it is across Australia, ice has become a terrible problem, with its reach extending from Darwin's nightclub strip to remote communities many hundreds of kilometres from the nearest city or town. It takes a terrible toll on individuals, on families and communities, and were it not for the efforts of the agencies such as the Crime Commission and CrimTrack, the problem would be much worse, I fear. In May last year, the ACC reported in its illicit drug data report that the price of methamphetamine in the Northern Territory was $1,600 an ounce, compared with the national average of $1,000 an ounce. The ACC Chief Executive, Chris Dawson, said the high price for ice in the Territory reflected the significant markup that occurs in remote communities. Other key findings in the illicit drug data report included the number of national illicit drug seizures and arrests, that the weight of drugs seized nationally in 2013-14 was the highest on record. Nationally, law enforcement seized a record number of amphetamine-type stimulants, and police also made 26,269 amphetamine-type stimulant-related arrests nationally, the highest on record. The annual median purity of analysed methamphetamine samples has continued to increase since 2010-11, with purity figures reported in the 13-14 financial year the highest on record. The number of national steroid seizures and arrests continue to increase and are also on the highest on record. The weight of other known drugs seized nationally is also the highest on record, increasing 600% from the previous reporting period. The majority of labs were relatively stable with 13 in the 13-14 period, with 744 detected right across Australia. The majority of these, or 68%, were detected in residential locations and 12% were detected in vehicles. The Australian law enforcement and justice agencies are increasingly dependent on accurate information and intelligence to ensure that our officers on the ground, at our borders and in our intelligence agencies can do their job. Merging CrimTrack and the ACC offers significant strategic opportunities to the agencies and national policing and justice sectors, such as increased connectivity between key national intelligence and police information agencies, the enhanced quality and timeliness of information and intelligence delivered to frontline officers, with improved agencies and national productivity by removing duplication and providing a single vision for the agencies, and an enhanced national threat picture, providing better evidence to inform operational decisions and decision-making and priorities. The more we can strengthen this capacity, the quicker our police will be able to identify the patterns and associations that can help detect and disrupt significant threats, including terrorism, international drug trafficking and cybercrime. The two bills will amend the ACC Act to enable the merged agency to carry out all of CrimTrac's functions, also known as National Policing Information Functions. This will enable the merged agency board to set high-level priorities for the agency's new National Policing Information Functions and provide the board with additional specific functions currently exercised by the CrimTrac board, such as making recommendations to the relevant Commonwealth Minister about expenditure for the National Policing Information Systems and Services special accounts. It will also ensure that merged agencies can continue to share policing information and enable the merged agency to continue CrimTrac's current funding model in the same way as CrimTrac currently does, as well as providing nationally coordinated criminal history checks to a range of stakeholders. Mr Deputy Speaker, the Coalition Government will continue to fight crimes at all levels within the community. Measures such as domestic violence strategy shows that we are committed to doing what it takes to stop crime in the home, and this legislation shows that we are prepared to hone organisations charged with upper-level crime and organised crimes. Mr Deputy Speaker, I know that you will agree with me in saying that I will always support legislation that will help our men and women in blue. They work tirelessly to keep our community safe, and I would like to place on record my thanks to all law enforcement agency members across the country, but I pay particular thanks to the men and women of the Northern Territory Police Force. And the new Commissioner, Rhys Kershaw, who's the new Commissioner for the Northern Territory, I think is doing a fantastic job. He and his team are working really hard to restore the Territory's community's faith back into our outstanding police force. Unfortunately, there's been a few bad eggs and perception wasn't as good as it should have been, but the men and women in our police force do an incredible job, and they shouldn't be judged on a few other bad eggs, but I have absolute 100% faith in Commissioner Kershaw and his team for restoring the community's faith. And as I said, I'd like to place on record my thanks to the men and women of the Northern Territory Police Force, and I hope that with this legislation passing, it will give them the tools that they need to fight crime in the Territory, to keep our home safe from this criminal element. So with that, Mr Deputy Speaker, I commend the bill to the House.
I thank the honourable member.
The member for Solomon.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Resources, Energy and North Australia. Will the Minister update the House on the visit to Australia today of the Executive Director of the International Energy Agency, Fatty Birrell? And Minister, how will growing global demand for energy support jobs and growth in Australia?
I call the Minister for Resources and Northern Australia.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I acknowledge the member for Solomon because she more than most understands the importance of global energy markets to jobs and growth in her electorate, with the $50 billion Ichthys LNG project, which has created more than 6,000 jobs. Today, Dr Birrell, the Executive Director of the IEA, was in Canberra to talk about the global energy outlook. And this followed a visit 2 weeks ago to Australia by the Indonesian Energy Minister and a visit tomorrow from the Indian Energy Minister. Importantly, Dr Birrell reaffirmed Australia's place in the global energy supply chain as the #1 exporter of LNG by 2020 and the second largest exporter in the world of coal. And also, Dr Birrell explained that despite the lower energy prices, that there is increasing global demand for energy. Global demand for energy will increase by 1/3 between now and 2040. Demand for gas will increase by 50% between now and 2040. And even though coal will be a smaller proportion
of the overall global energy mix, it will still increase demand by 10% between now and 2040. A reason for this growing demand for energy comes from our region, obviously China, Indonesia, Thailand, but also increasingly India. And India has around 300 million people who don't have access to electricity or little access to electricity. And already India's demand for energy has doubled since the year 2000. So the Indian Express has very much a long way to run. In addition to the increasing demand for fossil fuels, there's an increasing demand for renewable energy. And in 2014, half of the new energy power generation in the world came from renewable energy. And by 2040, 35% of the global energy mix will come from renewable energy, up from 22% today. And this is good news for Australia. And Dr Birol also praised Australia's contribution in Paris as both important and constructive. So, Mr Speaker, the member for Solomon is absolutely right that Dr Birol's visit today is highly important. He has reaffirmed Australia's role in the global energy supply chain. He has reaffirmed that this increased demand, particularly in our region, will create thousands of jobs into the future, billions of dollars worth of export income, and will also mean that we will continue to help millions of people be removed and alleviated from energy poverty throughout the world. Thank you.
The member for Solomon.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Immigration and Border Protection. Will the Minister update the House on the benefits of strong and consistent border protection policies, and is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches? What would be the consequences of altering the government's current strong and consistent approach?
The Minister for Immigration and Border Protection.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank most sincerely the member for Solomon. She's based in Darwin, the home of many of the assets of the Australian Border Force and many of the personnel that have worked over a number of years in the operation to stop the boats. And as people in this place know, as the Australian public knows, it is very important that we stare down the threat of people smugglers, because as the Shadow Minister for Immigration in his speech to the conference of the ALP last year said that Labor regretted the loss of 1,200 lives as a result of Labor's failure in this public policy area when they were last in government. But the most important thing, Mr Speaker, is to make sure that no government ever again repeats the mistake that Labor made when they were last in power. And there were 8,000 children who went into detention when the Labor Party was last in power. We have reduced that number down now to less than 80, in actual fact at 75. And my determination is to be the minister who gets kids out of detention, and we will reduce that number to 0. And so, Mr Speaker, the people smugglers in Indonesia now are looking at the statements made by the Leader of the Opposition, by the Prime Minister, by myself, by state premiers, by the Shadow Minister for Immigration, and they are desperate to find an opportunity to recast that message into a message of opportunity for people, vulnerable people who would be willing to pay money to get on a boat, potentially lose their life at sea and to settle in Australia. Well, I am not going, and this government, Mr Speaker, is not going to allow that situation to arise. We have dealt with this threat. We have stopped these boats. We are turning back boats where it's safe to do so. We are dealing with people in a compassionate and humane way. We have, for a long period of time, as I've informed the House before, had ongoing discussions with third countries to see whether or not we can provide settlement arrangements. But we have been consistent in saying that if you seek to come to Australia illegally by boat, you will not settle in this country. Now, the Labor Party has, at its conference and on some opportunities since, repeated that message and said, well, we are adopting the policy of the Liberal Party, but it is starting to unravel. We see in the caucus of the Labor Party today, and we've seen over recent days, the Deputy Leader of the Opposition trying to carve herself out a separate space in relation to this important debate, bearing in mind that if the Labor Party wins the next election and Bill Shorten becomes Prime Minister, that person, the Deputy Leader, would be around the National Security Committee of Cabinet and would be undermining what the Labor Party says its policy is today. And what we know in the past is what we know now, and that is that the Labor Party will go to an election promising one thing. If they're elected and they get into government, they will do the dead opposite.
Thank the member for Parramatta. The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the honourable member for Solomon.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. Under the heading Innovation, Chapter 3 of David Burry's Financial Systems Inquiry paints a cautiously optimistic picture of the role of new technologies and business practices in Australia's economy of the future. To provide a context for the legislation we're debating today, I'll place on record a précis to the important chapter in David Murray's overall body of work. Technology-driven innovation is transforming the financial system, as evidenced by the emergence of new business models and products and substantial investment in areas such as mobile banking, cloud computing and payment systems or payment services. Although innovation has the potential to deliver significant efficiency benefits and improve system outcomes, it also brings with it risks. Consumers, businesses and governments can be adversely affected by new developments, which may also challenge regulatory frameworks and regulators' abilities to respond. He says the inquiry believes the innovative potential of Australia's financial system and broader economy can be supported by taking action to ensure policy settings facilitate future innovations that benefits consumers, businesses and indeed government. The inquiry's recommendations to facilitate innovation aim to encourage industry and government to work together to identify innovation opportunities and emerging network benefits where governments may need to facilitate industry coordination and action. To strengthen Australia's digital identity framework through the development of a national strategy for federal-style model of trusted digital identities, and to remove unnecessary regulatory impediments to innovation, particularly in the payment system and in fundraising for small business. Enable the development of data-driven business models through holding a productivity commission inquiry into the costs and benefits of increasing access and improving the use of private and public sector data. The report adds, these recommendations will contribute to develop a dynamic, competitive, growth-orientated and forward-looking financial system for Australia. The past couple of sittings have seen the federal government begin to shape its legislative response to the Murray inquiry, and the Corporations Amendment or the crowdsource funding bill is part of this overall picture. But its origins are more closely linked with the government's national innovation and science agenda, which will shape economic development in this country in the years and decades to come. Crowdsource funding or crowdsource equity funding, or crowdfunding as it's sometimes called, is an emerging way for startups and early-stage businesses to access the funding and investment they need to move the size and scope of their businesses up to the next level. At the same time, it maintains adequate protections for retail investors who share in the risks and also in the successes of these businesses. The legislation will allow unlisted public companies with less than $5 million in assets and less than $5 million in annual turnover to raise up to $5 million in funds in any 12-month period. Companies that become an unlisted company in order to access crowdsourced equity funding will receive a holiday of up to 5 years from some reporting and governance requirements. In order to allow investors to make informed decisions, companies raise funds through crowdfunding will be required to release an offer document. To ensure that mum and dad investors are not exposed to excessive risks, a cap of $10,000 per issuer over a 12-month period will be introduced. The Australian Securities and Investment Commission will have oversight of the new arrangements, and this legislation represents a fundamental change in our business investment landscape, blending key aspects of the Corporations Act as it relates to public and proprietary companies. In Australia, there is an historical distinction between public and proprietary companies which underpins the Corporations Act. A proprietary company is a company registered under the Corporations Act that is limited to having no more than 50 non-employee shareholders and, generally speaking, must not offer shares to the general public or undertake other fundraising activities that would require the use of a disclosure document. Proprietary companies are generally relatively small and closely held and have lower corporation or corporate governance and reporting obligations than do public companies. A public company is a company registered under the Corporations Act that is not a proprietary company. It is important to note that public companies are not required to be listed on the Australian Stock Exchange. In fact, only 1% of public companies actually list on the Australian Stock Exchange. The government's CSEF, or the Crowdsourcing Equity Framework, will not apply to listed public companies. This distinction between the rights and obligations of proprietary and public companies is an underlying rationale of the Corporations Act 2001 and applies to all companies. If crowdsourced equity funding were to be facilitated through the proprietary rather than the public company structure, there would need to be an exemption from the 50 shareholder limit and the prohibition on making offers to the public. The proprietary company obligations would also need to be increased to require an offer document for crowdsourced equity funding offers to the public. If such exemptions were to be as part of the crowdsourced equity funding framework, once no longer eligible for this disclosure and reporting exemptions, the proprietary companies would be required to undertake one of the following two actions to bring them back into line with the Corporations Act of 2001. Option 1 is if the company wished to continue with more than 50 shareholders, it would need to convert to a public company and then comply with the increased disclosure and reporting rules. Option 2, if the company wished to continue as a proprietary company, it would need to undertake a selective share buyback until it had fewer than 50 shareholders. This is a time-consuming and costly process and would see companies lose significant amounts of capital in paying out shareholders. So in contrast, the government's crowdsourced equity funding model, public company model, requires no further action at the end of the crowdsourced equity funding exemption beyond complying with the standard public company disclosure and reporting rules. The government's crowdsourcing equity funding framework anticipates that the crowdsourced funding accessing companies are seeking to grow through capital sourced from a crowd, or to use the more conventional corporate language, shareholders. So as I described earlier, to facilitate this growth, the framework provides exemptions for up to 5 years for compliant crowdsourced funding companies from the most regulatory burdensome aspect of administering a public company. After that holiday period, or upon no longer being eligible for the crowdsourced funding framework, for example, due to company growth beyond the turnover and asset caps, crowdsourced equity funded companies with more than 50 shareholders will need to comply with the reporting and governance arrangements like all other Australian public companies. Intermediary plays an important role in crowdsourced funding and will vet companies seeking to raise funds, run offers including suspending or closing offers where there are disclosure concerns, and handle investors' money. ASIC will develop a separate Australian financial services licence authorisation for crowdsource funding intermediaries. Australia is not alone in regulating the role of intermediaries in crowdsource funding ventures. The New Zealand and United States model also requires them to be licensed. Crowdsource funding intermediaries must comply with certain obligations, including conducting prescribed checks around the identity of issuing companies and their officers, confirming the issuing company is eligible to use crowdsourced equity funding, and checking that other documents contained the required content that are not misled or misleading or deceptive. Intermediaries must ensure that a risk warning appears prominently on its platforms at all times, providing an application facility for investors, ensuring cooling off rights are available to available to retail investors, disclosure fees paid to the intermediary by the issuer, stop an offer if the intermediary knows the offer document is defective, and enforce the per issue investor cap. In answer to the question, how will an intermediary determine if it has conducted the prescribed checks to a reasonable standard, the government proposes to include direction on what could be considered reasonable in the regulations, along with details of the checks themselves to increase certainty for intermediaries. The intent of this bill is to assist startups and other small businesses that may have difficulty accessing equity funding due to the costs of disclosure and other requirements, which is why the gross assets and turnover caps are set at the $5 million limit. We have set a $5 million asset and turnover test as it ensures the framework is appropriately focused on startups and genuine small businesses. The $5 million fundraising cap is consistent with the maximum limit under ASIC's Business Introduction and Matching Service class order. The $5 million limit is higher than the equivalent limits in the United States and indeed New Zealand. Concessions from corporate governance and reporting requirements only apply to newly incorporated or converted public companies because these obligations can be costly for small companies. Newly incorporated or converted public companies that make a crowdsource funding offer within 12 months of registration will benefit from interim exemptions from holding annual general meetings, having financial statements audited, and sending annual reports to stakeholders. These concessions are intended to facilitate access to crowdsource funding for companies that cannot yet meet the public company obligations. They are not intended as a means by which existing public companies should reduce their reporting or interactions with their existing shareholder base. The $5 million cap acknowledges that investing in early-stage companies can be risky. While crowdsource equity is an exciting new asset class for retail investors, lower disclosure requirements may also make it more difficult for retail investors to assess the relative risks of offers. For crowdsource funding to be a viable long-term option, investors must have confidence in the sector and the investments that they make. A retail investor cap will mitigate investor risk by limiting exposures to individual offerings and to issuers. The Coalition Government intends to keep the cap under review, and the regulation will allow for amendment over time if the government feels this is appropriate. The legislation provides the Minister with additional exemption powers in relation to the Australian market licences. The Australian market licence regime was designed with large public exchange in mind and impose obligations that may not be appropriate for other market types. The Minister currently has the power to exempt a market from the need to hold a licence or clearing and settlement licence, but does not have the power to exempt a market from individual obligations, and there is no scope to tailor a licence to suit the circumstances of an individual market. This means markets may be required to comply with obligations that are clearly excessive in their particular case or exempted from obligations that would be appropriate. Extending the exemption powers will provide for more effective and flexible licensing regimes that could appropriately respond to and facilitate innovation. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, I should point out in conclusion that the Government will also consult on options to facilitate crowdsourced debt funding during 2016. So with that, I commend the bill to the House.
Call the honourable member for Solomon.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. The legislation that we are debating today is of national significance, but in the Northern Territory, issues of firearms have been causing police and the broader community headaches for many years. In the last few days, reports have emerged of firearm incidents in an industrial neighbourhood only minutes from my home in Palmerston. The ABC reported the incident under the header "Darwin Rebels Motorcycle Gang Clubhouse Targeted in Drive-by Shooting." The report continues that a drive-by shooting at the Darwin clubhouse of an outlaw motorcycle gang has led to police seizing 2 guns and methamphetamines, but the shooter remains at large. Quote, "The Northern Territory Gangs Task Force is investigating the shooting, which happened early on Saturday morning while members of the Rebels gang were inside the Yarrawonga building. After a search of the premises in the Palmerston suburb of Bakewell, police seized 2 firearms and the methamphetamines. Investigating Officer Detective Senior Sergeant Mark Stringer, a very, very good police officer, said the rebels arrived in Darwin 5 years ago and since then have been making, quote, "a name for themselves." That includes their involvement in the theft of weapons from a Navy patrol boat back in 2012. In that incident, Northern Territory Supreme Court records show that Seaman Matthew Evans stole guns from a Royal Australian Navy patrol boat at Darwin's Larrakia Naval Base because he felt pressured by the outlaw motorcycle gang. The event did make national headlines in November 2012 and was a significant and disturbing breach of security at a very important Australian naval establishment. Seaman Evans gained access to the Larrakia base using his security pass, and then once was inside the base, he covered his face with a beanie and boarded a patrol boat he once worked on. He briefly struggled with a watchman and restrained the watchman with cable ties before stealing 14 guns. I say again, Mr Deputy Speaker, before stealing 14 guns. The guns were, thankfully, later recovered from a Darwin unit. Evans pleaded guilty to several charges, and for his trouble he was seriously bashed in prison and spent a considerable period of his prison sentence in protective custody. It's disturbing enough that the Rebels gang is in Darwin at all, but the fact that they are accessing firearms is absolutely horrifying. The weekend incident in which shots were fired at their premises is not the only firearms-related incident investigated by the Northern Territory Police this year. Only 5 weeks into 2016, and police have already issued a media statement urging firearm owners to take all necessary measures to ensure the safety of their weapons. The 12th of January statement said, "Northern Territory Police are asking gun owners to rethink their security and double-check their gun safe to ensure that the keys are kept in a secure location following the theft of firearms from homes during recent break-ins." Sergeant Amy Meredith from the Firearms Policy section said police were concerned at the ease with which offenders are finding and using gun-safe keys. She said gun owners have a responsibility to ensure the safekeeping of firearms and pointed out that under Northern Territory legislation, gun owners must take all reasonable precautions to ensure that the firearms are kept safely and that they are not lost or stolen, and that they do not come into possession of persons not authorised to possess them. The media release did not go into detail on how many firearms had actually been stolen or the exact type of weapon, but in my old hometown of Alice Springs, 2016 has seen at least 3 firearm-related incidents. One of those related to the theft of a rifle, a shotgun and ammunition from a home in Breitling, and just last week police appealed for public assistance following the overnight theft of a firearm from a vehicle in Caterpillar Court. The report says between 7:30 on the 3rd of February and 6:15 a.m. on the 4th of February, an unsecure Ruger Imperial bolt-action .308 calibre rifle, which was inside a canvas cover, as well as a quantity of ammunition, was removed from a vehicle by an unknown offender or offenders." End quote. Superintendent Peter Gordon went on to say that firearms that get into the wrong hands can have fatal consequences, and he is so right. On Thursday the 21st of January, the home of a 34-year-old Alice Springs man was searched, and as well as drugs, 2 .22 calibre rifles were seized, one of which was sawn off, and a 12-gauge rifle was also seized. The 2 rifles had apparently been stolen during a break-in in October 2015. These disturbing accounts only reinforce the need for strong measures to prevent firearms from getting into the wrong hands. And by that I mean the rebel bikie gang members or methamphetamine addicts. And I'm not saying that the bikies are methamphetamine addicts, so there's 2 different kinds of groups there. The Criminal Code Amendment Firearms Trafficking Bill 2015 will amend the Act to implement the Coalition Government's election commitment contained within the government's policy to tackle crime, which we released in August 2013, to introduce mandatory minimum sentence of 5-year imprisonment for firearm trafficking offences. It will see the maximum penalties of those offences doubled from 10 years imprisonment and a fine of 2,500 penalty units, or both, to 20 years imprisonment or a fine of 5,000 penalty units, or both. The introduction of increased maximum penalties and mandatory minimum sentences of 5 years imprisonment for firearm trafficking offences is consistent with the government's commitment to pursue a strong and nationally consistent approach to gun crime. The members opposite, in their desire to be difficult and to foster the ambition of hardcore criminals to get away with a light sentencing, have expressed issues around mandatory minimum sentencing. The Coalition Government believes that mandatory minimum sentences are necessary and will act as a strong deterrent for those who would otherwise engage in illicit firearm trafficking. As the provisions do not impose a mandatory non-parole period, the actual time a person will be incarcerated will remain at the discretion of the sentencing judge. The level of judicial discretion provides protection against arbitrary detention and demonstrates this government's commitment to limiting and infringement against the right. These measures also do not apply to children, which in legal terms means anybody under the age of 18. For the Australian Labor Party to have taken this position, it's very difficult to understand. On 2 prior attempts by the Coalition Government to crack down on illegal firearm trafficking by introducing mandatory minimum sentences, our amendments have been blocked by Labor's hypocrisy. This is all a bit hypocritical, if you ask me, because they claim that their opposition to mandatory minimum sentencing is laid out in their Australian Labor Party's national platform, although in 2010 Labor legislated mandatory minimum sentencing for people smuggling. So while Labor does go soft on crime, the Coalition Government is getting on with delivering what we promised to the Australian people: a safer and more secure nation. The criminal use of firearms is a matter of considerable concern to the community. The introduction of even a small number of illegal firearms or firearm parts into Australia can have a significant impact on the threat posed by the illicit market. The amended penalties aim to more adequately reflect the serious nature and the potential consequences of supplying firearms and firearm parts to the illicit market. Tough sentencing for illegal firearms trafficking sends a strong message that gun-related crime and violence is a serious threat to the safety of all Australians. These amendments are in addition to the work the Coalition Government has done since coming to government to create a safer and more secure nation. After savage cuts by Labor, one of the first things we did when we came to government was to invest $88 million to increase screening and examination of international mail, air and sea cargo. That's right, Mr Deputy Speaker, $88 million. This funding boost gives our agencies greater tools to detect illicit firearms and firearm parts at our borders. Shortly after coming to government, we introduced the National Anti-Gang Squad with strike teams now in Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland, Western Australia and liaison officers in the Territory and other jurisdictions. And their role is to target outlaw motorcycle gangs within Australia, particularly their role in firearm trafficking. Since the introduction of the Anti-Gang Squad in 2013, 535 illegal firearms have been taken off the streets around the country. In February 2015, the Coalition Government closed a loophole that allowed criminals to avoid prosecution for trafficking firearm parts into Australia. Without those amendments, criminals could evade trafficking offences and penalties simply by breaking down the firearms and then trafficking the parts separately. And in response to the joint Commonwealth New South Wales Martin Place siege review, which identified weaknesses in Australia's ability to maintain and share firearm information between jurisdictions, CrimTrack is developing the National Firearms Interface to assist police and firearm registration authorities register firearms, licensed firearm owners and tracking of the movement of firearms in and out of Australia. This interface will provide a single record of each firearm in Australia, detailing every event in its history, from importation or manufacture for sale in Australia through to its exportation or its destruction. It will create a national picture of firearm data by linking with existing state and territory firearm registration systems, which will continue to be used. This will improve information and intelligence sharing on firearms, providing essential support for law enforcement agencies. And Mr Deputy Speaker, as you know, I am a wife of a police officer, so I think it's really important that we do everything we can on this side to make sure that we provide the legislative support for our men and women in blue, because their job is to keep us safe. And I think that they do a fantastic job, and I commend the Minister for putting this legislation beforehand, and I call on those opposite to support our men and women in blue, to stop this hypocritical behaviour, get on board and sign up, and let's provide this support to our men and women in blue. With that, Mr Deputy Speaker, I commend the bill to the House.
I thank the member for Solomon. The question is the amendment be agreed to, and I call the member for Solomon.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. At the end of the 2014 financial year, there were 14,289 registered businesses in the Northern Territory. Most of these are in the electorate of Solomon, which, as many of you know, covers all of Darwin and all of Palmerston. In fact, 78.2% of the Territory's businesses are based in Darwin or Palmerston. Only 6.6% are in Alice Springs, 5.3% are in Katherine, and approximately 10% are across the rest of the Northern Territory. The Territory's population is around 244,000 people, so it's plain to see that small business is crucial and a very big component of economic activity, job creation and social cohesion in our small but rapidly growing jurisdiction. Which brings me to the reason why I'm on my feet today. When this government released its May 2015 budget, the Northern Territory Chamber of Commerce could barely hide its delight under the header Small Business Front and Centre in Federal Budget. The Chamber was extremely positive about the Coalition's approach to business, and I quote, "The engine room of the national economy, the small business sector, has received a much-needed boost in the federal budget, according to the Territory's peak business organisation, the Chamber of Commerce Northern Territory." 5 years ago, the small business community wasn't even mentioned on budget night, but now it is front and centre of budget commentary. In fact, this is a small business budget, which is great news for the Territory, where over 95% of businesses are SMEs, said the Chamber of Commerce, Greg Bicknell. So that's a very important point made by Mr Bicknell that I want to put on the record in this chamber about the approach of the previous Labor government to small business in this country. I want to reiterate that 5 years ago, the Labor government did not make one mention of the very important small business sector in its budget. And as I said, that was according to the Chamber of Commerce. They wanted that point made, and so I'm very happy to reiterate that point here today. It's quite extraordinary that not one single mention of small business and in the Labor's budget. As far as I'm concerned, that's an extraordinary omission by a government and a very timely reminder in an election year of Labor's conflicted and very, very confused priorities. Or to put it another way, a vote for Labor is a vote against small business. And that would be a substantial mistake given that 96% of all Australian businesses are indeed small business. These employ over 4.5 million people and produce over $330 billion of our nation's economic output each year. And there's no shortage of enterprising Australians wanting to enter the small business sector. In the 2013-14 financial year, Australians started over 280,000 small businesses. In stark contrast to the Labor Party's 2010 offering, the Coalition Government's 2015 budget contained the Jobs and Small Business Package, which, as reflected in commentary by the Northern Territory Chamber of Commerce and others, was extremely well received. I will take a moment to focus on one of its most popular measures, and that was the accelerated depreciation, under which all small businesses received an immediate tax reduction or tax deduction for individual assets that they purchased that cost less than $20,000. Increasing the depreciation threshold from $1,000 to $20,000 meant improved cash flow for small businesses, and I know that our local Harvey Normans were very, very excited about this announcement, and it meant that small businesses were able to go in and get some new computers and get some new office equipment and up to the value of $20,000. And I also know that there was a number of there were some cars that were available for $19,999 as a result of this announcement that we made. This announcement encouraged small businesses to bring forward their investments in the assets that they needed to grow their businesses and service their customers. And I have to say that I got absolutely very amazingly positive feedback on this announcement. It meant that more money was in the hands of small business operators and less in the hands of government. The revised threshold also meant small businesses spent less time tracking assets across various years for tax purposes. This cut red tape and allowed business owners to focus on running and growing their business. And that's what this government's all about, ensuring that small businesses can have the opportunity to grow their business. It's not the job of government to get in there and to try and control small businesses. Similarly, the Tax Law Amendment Small Business Restructure Rollover Bill 2016 is about reducing red tape and making running small businesses easier. The bill puts into legislation the final item of the Growing Jobs and Small Business Package. In a nutshell, it provides greater flexibility for small business owners to change the legal structure of their business by allowing them to defer gains or losses that would otherwise be realised when business assets are transferred from one entity to another. In other words, small business owners who find that they are using a legal structure that does not quite suit their needs, they will no longer be stuck with that structure. They will be able to have the flexibility to change it. I want to reiterate some of the points that some of my colleagues have made, and in particular the member for Brisbane, when she said that when government released this measure as an exposure draft, the Restaurant and Catering Industry Association said that the ability to change a legal structure without incurring a capital gains liability represents a significant reduction in red tape for small hospitality operators. She would know better than most, with her family being in hospitality. But they went on to say that restructuring hospitality businesses always require assets to be transferred from one entity to another, attracting significant income tax liabilities, impacting cash flow and available capital, and that this discourages expansion, meaning some businesses remain inefficiently small, reducing productivity and dampening additional employment opportunities. Another sector, the Australian Automotive Dealer Association, was also extremely positive when the measure was announced and provided a comprehensive analysis of its implications, which I would like to put on the record. It's headed Improved Flexibility for Small Business Restructuring, and it says that the amendments make it easier for small business owners to restructure by allowing them to defer gains or losses that would otherwise be made from transferring business assets from one entity to another. The new small business rollover is in addition to rollovers currently available where a sole trader or partner or partnership transfers assets to or creates assets in a company in the course of business restructures. Under current laws, restructuring requires business assets to be transferred from one entity to another, such as from a company to a trust, and significant income tax liabilities may arise. The impact of these liabilities on cash flow and available capital may create an impediment to restructuring. Currently, rollovers relief is available in limited circumstances for business restructures. So the Growing Jobs and Small Business Package in the 2015-16 budget introduced a rollover to allow small businesses to change legal structure without attracting capital gains tax liability at that particular point. These amendments seek to provide further flexibility for small business owners by extending the rollover to apply to capital gains and losses arising from the transfer of capital gains tax assets, depreciating assets, and also trading stock or revenue assets between entities as part of a small business restructure. There are two types of entities that may be eligible for the rollover. The first is that those that are in small business entities in the income year in which the transfer takes place and that satisfy the maximum net asset value. An entity will be a small entity if it carries on a business then with a combined annual turnover of the entity and other entities that are affiliated or connected with it is less than $2 million. The entity must also satisfy the maximum net asset value test, which requires the sum of the net value of the entity's capital gains tax assets together with the net value of capital gains assets of other entities that are affiliated or connected with to be less than $6 million. This is the first kind of entity may access the rollover relation in terms of the capital gains asset that are assets of businesses carried on by the small business entity. The second kind of entity that might be eligible for the rollover is one that is an affiliate of or is connected with a small business entity for the income year that satisfies the maximum net asset value test at the time of the transfer. These entities may access the rollover in relation to their capital gains test assets and satisfy subsection 152-10(1)(a) or 1(b) of the Income Tax Assessment Act of 1997, which relate to passively held assets that are used by the small business entity in their business. This was a very positive and very detailed analysis of the amendments by the Australian Auto Dealer Association that mirrors other positive feedback attributed to the amendment. In Australia, small businesses may operate as sole traders, partnerships, trust companies, or a combination of any of them. A small business owner may take a number of factors into account in determining which structure is the most appropriate for their business, including tax issues, personal liability, access to equity capital, and of course, compliance cost. The most appropriate structure for a small business may change over time, or a new small business may select an initial legal structure that it later finds to be inappropriate. Restructuring into a more appropriate legal structure may help a business to continue to develop and grow. It may also help it to avoid unnecessary compliance costs, enhance its business efficiency, move to a more efficient structure for tax purposes, or indeed enable the small business to adapt to its current conditions. This bill introduces a new subdivision 328G into the Income Tax Assessment Act of 1997, which enables small businesses to change the legal structure of their business and have the capital gains tax liability disregarded and deferred until eventual disposal. This differs to current legislation, as in the current law, rollovers are only available in very limited areas that encompass those areas and expand the areas covered by tax exemptions for rollovers by including all legal entities. A practical example of how the amendments will impact on business was published online by respected business analyst Julie van der Velde, who wrote, "An individual starts a business in her own name and is more successful more quickly than she ever expected. The rollover can be used to move that business to a more appropriate structure, giving better asset protection, more access to funding, and a better tax environment for the reinvestment of profit. Assuming the business holds no land, there will be neither tax nor duty on the rollover." As I said earlier, the tax amendment Small Business Restructure Rollover Bill is about streamlining business and easing some of the pressure off business operators who are the backbone of our economy. The new law is expected to apply from the 1st of July this year and will have around $40 million revenue costs to the budget. In my view, this is a very sensible approach to helping small business thrive. And with that in mind, Mr Deputy Speaker, I commend the bill to the House.
I thank the member for Solomon. The question is the amendment agreed to, and I call the member for Solomon.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise today to contribute to the Appropriations Bill debate, in part to acknowledge the strong record of delivery by the Coalition Government since its election 2.5 years ago, and also to lay out the many programs the government has implemented in my electorate of Solomon and indeed the Northern Territory since 2013. I'll begin by going back a few days to Thursday the 19th of February, which is a very significant day for in Darwin, for our sometimes turbulent history. February 19th is the first day of the bombing. The Japanese launched 188 planes from aircraft carriers and bombs rained on the harbour and town. 10 ships were sunk, around 250 people were killed, 400 were injured, 30 aircraft were destroyed, and the city was in absolute chaos. Oil slicks across Darwin Harbour, smashed and burning buildings, people dead and dying. It was an event of catastrophic significance which saw the loss of American as well as Australian personnel. Yet, outside the Northern Territory, very little is known about it compared to, say, the Kokoda Track or the Thai-Burma Railway. Out of respect for those who died trying to defend their country at our own back door, the event should have a national profile. Through my own efforts and a great friend of the Territory, the former Labor Senator Trish Crossan, the one that was sadly replaced by Captain's Pick, who has disappointed us all, but through our efforts, Trish and I were able to have the bombing of Darwin declared a National Day of Observance. This has raised the status of February 19th from a day of local commemoration to one of national significance. And next year we will commemorate the 75th anniversary of the bombing of Darwin. It's important that we acknowledge our past and we celebrate our future. This year I laid a wreath on behalf of the Prime Minister alongside my husband Paul and Mr. Masato Takako, who is the Consul General for Japan. Now, this was a very moving moment for the three of us, and I'm pleased that our countries are now firm friends. Mr. Deputy Speaker, North Australia contributes over 11% of Australia's GDP and has 40% of Australia's GDP, but only around 5% of our population. The North Australia Infrastructure Fund is set to commence in 2016-17 financial year, and I'm looking forward to seeing ambitious nation-building projects growing the Territory. Indeed, population growth will be crucial in driving investment in Northern Australia, particularly in cities like Darwin. Leading demographer Bernard Salt said last year that if the government is to succeed in developing the North, Darwin's population will need to grow by 70% to reach around 250,000 or 300,000 over the next 30 to 40 years. The government's vision for North Australia lays the foundation for this to occur over the next 2 decades. It includes $600 million for roads, cash to upgrade airstrips and money to explore rail freight, $100 million for beef roads and $200 million for water infrastructure and $75 million towards a cooperative research centre and measures to develop even closer links with Asia. In partnership with the Northern Territory Government, the Coalition is spending $70 million duplicating Tiger Brennan Drive, one of the 2 main arterial roads in and out of Darwin. In 2014, I was proud to have the former Deputy Prime Minister Warren Truss in my electorate to open the first stage of the duplication. And I can assure the former Deputy Prime Minister that work on the next phase of the project, duplicating the road out to the Berrima Lights, is powering ahead, notwithstanding the discovery of the occasional bomb dropped during one of the raids that I mentioned earlier. The duplication means that Palmerston residents and those from further afield can enjoy a quicker and safer commute into and out of the CBD, spending a lot less time in their cars and more time doing the things that they like to do, and many Territorians like to spend time fishing. Also growing the Territory through the Investment Road and Rail program, the Coalition is spending $18 million improving flood immunity, road safety and productivity on the Stewart Highway, the other arterial road into and out of the city between Katherine and Darwin. Still on roads, the Black Spots program has provided a boost to road safety in Solomon, with funding approved for the following projects. Some of these have been funded directly to the Darwin City Council or the Palmerston City Council, while others have been directed to the Northern Territory Government for their road expenditure. So we have expenditure on the Trowell Road and Dripstone Road intersection in Waggaman is $120,000. In Smith Street and Edmund Street intersection in the Darwin CBD, there's $43,000 being spent. On McMillan's Road and Lee Point Road intersection in Moyle, there's $400,000 being spent. On the Stewart Highway and Amy Johnson Avenue intersection in Coonawarra, there's $100,000 being spent. In Stewart Highway between Bagot Road and Billeroy Road in the Narrows, there's $200,000 being spent to upgrade that area. And in the city, once again, Smith Street and Daly Street intersection, $550,000 is being used to implement a roundabout. In Ryland Road and Clark Crescent intersection in Rapid Creek, there's $75,000 being spent for road infrastructure there. The same thing with Temple Terrace and Emery Avenue intersection in Grey. There's $500,000 being spent to upgrade that intersection. And in Orundi Avenue and Bonson Terrace intersection in Maldon, there's $260,000 being spent from Black Spots program to upgrade that particular intersection. And of course, the Flockhart Drive Bridge between Muster Road and Campfire Court in Marlow Lagoon, there's $440,000 being spent to put up a pedestrian bridge to make sure that the children going to and from the Palmerston Christian College are going to be safe from the road traffic. These upgrades are about improving safety on our local roads, and as the local member, I am extremely proud to have been able to work with the Solomon community to firstly identify, but also to firmly secure road investment in these particular roads. Solomon has benefited from the Roads to Recovery program, with the City of Darwin receiving $5.72 million and the City of Palmerston $2.47 million to upgrade local roads. The National Stronger Regions Fund has had its heart economic development, and third round submissions have recently opened for this much sought after nation building measure. Darwin City Council's request for almost $4.5 million for its ambitious upgrade to Parat Pool was approved in round one, and I look forward to working with the Darwin City Council, in particular Lord Mayor Katrina Fong Lim, as this project proceeds. Now, some concerns were raised around the Northern Territory that we weren't able to secure any funding in round two, and no one was more disappointed than myself. And we've got some feedback from those applications, and we're working to secure funding in the next round. And I encourage anyone who is interested in submitting for the round three to work with my office so we can ensure that we get some much needed funding in the Territory. The Anzac Centenary Local Government Program was an extremely popular measure in Solomon. The Commonwealth funded $1.7 million to help with the enormously successful Albert Barella track. This reenactment of the incredible journey by Albert Barella and his companions that he took from Tennant Creek to Darwin after the war broke out, by train, by horseback, on foot, and eventually by boat. Albert Barella went to extraordinary lengths to enlist in the Great War, and after a short campaign at Gallipoli, he eventually came back to the Territory as the first and only Victoria Cross winner on the battlefields of Europe. At a local level, I was extremely pleased with the $125,000 Anzac Centenary program that allowed local communities to form to assess submissions. The Solomon Committee was bipartisan, with representatives from the Northern Territory Government and also from the opposition benches of the Legislative Assembly, and included veterans, leading military historian, the editor of the Darwin and Palmerston Sun, a youth representative, and also we received input from the Chief Minister's Department. A substantial number of nominations were received, but the primary criterion upon successful application were judged was the enduring nature of the proposal. For example, Darwin's RSL sub-branch received the lion's share of funding through a $50,000 grant towards a documentary about the Albert Barella trek, included footage of the reenactment ride into Darwin. Other grant recipients were the Vietnam veterans, who received $3,357 to spread the Anzac history to all Northern Territory students. through a book. The Girl Guides received $1,750 to construct an Anzac Centenary Memorial Garden at their Parap headquarters. The Darwin Military Museum received $5,275 to contribute towards a Great War museum display. St Paul's Primary School received $2,333 to install an Anzac commemorative plaque and a flagpole. The Palmerston RSL sub-branch received $18,583 to conduct an Anzac Eve Youth Vigil and the Great War Research Competition in Palmerston. The Moyle Primary School received $5,000 to perform the production from Darwin to Darnells. Darwin High School also received $5,000 to hold an Anzac assembly featuring a tribute to the silent service of the Australian submarine flotilla. The Darwin Military Museum received $27,000 to produce and distribute a book including a teacher's guide about those who served in the Great War. And I've spoken about that book that was written by Norman Cramp. It's a fantastic book and I was delighted to be able to launch that a few weeks ago. Casuarina Senior College received $875 to help them hold an Anzac Centenary commemorative weekend service, and the Darwin RSL sub-branch received $7,262 for rectification and correction of deceased listings on the Darwin's First World War cenotaph. I'm extremely proud to have been involved with this program when its roots well and truly in the Solomon community. As somebody with a great uncle who served and died in Europe fighting for his country, it was extremely satisfying to have been able to, in a small way, honour the sacrifice of those who took part in the war to end all wars. The former Deputy Prime Minister also opened the Housing Industry Association Multi-Purpose Building Industry Training Centre project, which was supported with a $3.3 million from the Regional Development Australia Fund and the $7.5 million Michael Long Territory Thunder Learning and Leadership Centre was also built with support from this funding pool, and it was opened by former Minister Jamie Briggs. Law and order was an unusual focus for the Commonwealth governments, but the Coalition was keen to help ease the pressure on the states and territories in this space. The result for Solomon was the purchase of 2 mobile CCTV units that have been deployed on a as-needs basis, such as Nightcliff, Karama and the Palmerston Shopping Centre. And these are wonderful pieces of infrastructure that provide awesome support to our police officers. And the Green Army has been busy in Solomon with up to 30 volunteers, mostly aged between 17 and 24, assisting local groups including the McMinns Lagoon Reservation Association, even though that's not in Solomon, but Friends of the Casuarina Coastal Reserve, Friends of Fog Dam and Friends of Mitchell Creek on revegetation, clean-up and signage projects. I want to acknowledge the really good work by Conservation Volunteers Australia in facilitating these projects, and funding has also been approved for a particularly exciting project under the auspice of Greening Australia, which, with the support of the Green Army, aims to establish the largest seed bank in the Northern Territory. The Green Army will assist in the collection of seeds, their cataloguing and storage, with an eye eventually on having the seed stock registered both nationally and globally. And I'm delighted that the Green Army is able to assist in this early stages of the important project. Now, there's been some talk about the Palmerston Hospital, and I noticed that the Labor Shadow Minister over there. I am delighted to say that the project is well and truly underway. The Northern Territory Government has responsibility for delivering on this. We've funded it, and despite all the lies from those across there, it is well and truly underway. And my opponent, the wannabe politician, needs to stop with his scaremongering. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
The member for Solomon. The questions of this bill will be now read a second time. I give the call to the member for Ballarat.
The member for Solomon.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and my question is to the Minister for Immigration and Border Protection. Will the Minister please inform the House how the investment outlined in the Defence White Paper will contribute to border security and continue to put people smugglers out of business?
The Minister for Immigration and Border Protection.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and can I say sincerely thank you very much to the honourable member for her question. She's a great champion for defence families and for the industry in the Northern Territory and in Darwin in particular, and she works very hard to make sure that there's further investment into the Northern Territory. I'm very pleased, very proud to be part of the government that has today announced $30 billion to defence over the next decade. Last week I was in Washington with the Attorney-General where we met with our counterparts to talk about national security issues and also in relation to immigration and border protection issues. And it is, as my colleagues have pointed out earlier in question time, absolutely the first responsibility of any government to make sure that we can protect our nation, to protect our people and to protect our borders. And the success that we've had under Operation Sovereign Borders, the fact that we've been able to turn Labor's policy of 1,200 people drowning at sea into not one drowning at sea, the fact that we've been able to turn 800 boats arriving under Labor's time to no boats effectively under our time, it means that we've been able to remove people from detention. And I can say to this House, Mr Speaker, I can say to this House that we would not have been able to achieve this success without the support of the Australian Defence Force. And the fact that in the White Paper there is an announcement of 12 new offshore patrol vessels that will be home ported in Darwin. That is in the member for Solomon's electorate. In fact, over the decade there will be $8.2 billion spent upgrading defence facilities in the Northern Territory. And people in the Northern Territory know that that will only be delivered under this government. So when they go to the next election and they're voting for the member for Solomon, they'll know that they are voting for somebody who is going to deliver $8 billion of investment into that local economy as opposed to nothing from the Labor Party. Now, in my home state of Queensland, we've been able to, in this white paper, promise $3.5 billion in defence facility upgrades over the decade to 2025-26, and it includes additional facilities in Cairns, it includes additional facilities elsewhere, but it also includes new offshore patrol vessels, as I mentioned before, which is going to be a great boost to Northern Australia. And the member for Leichhardt has championed this cause for a long period of time. The member for Herbert will be very proud of the fact that we invest more money into Gallipoli Barracks, and the member for Capricornia will be very proud of the fact that we put more money into Shoalwater Bay. So this government, Mr Speaker, takes the security of this nation very seriously. Labor promised a lot when it came to all sorts of policy areas, including defence and border protection. In the end, they delivered nothing. This government has promised a funded policy out to 2025-26, which will secure our borders and which will deliver safety to the Australian people.
The honourable member for Solomon.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I rise to speak on this a matter of public importance. I think that it's absolutely ridiculous that the opposition is so out of touch and so out of sync with the Australian community and the issues that are facing the country that it has nothing to offer except for distractions like this so-called MPI. So try and to give themselves some relevance. I agree with the Assistant Minister for Defence, who he says you can't trust Labor, and I agree with him. You can't trust Labor, and Labor do not give a shit about defence. Not one ship, Mr Deputy Speaker. In 6 years, Labor didn't give one ship. It's absolutely disgraceful. Meanwhile, the Coalition continues to do its best to turn around the mess of 6 years of Labor. Every single day, the Turnbull government is actually out there growing the economy, Mr Deputy Speaker, developing the foundations of the country for the future, crafting the building blocks that will drive growth and prosperity for every Australian man, woman and child for the generations to come. More than $1 billion into innovation, about $70 billion into schools, $54 billion into higher education, $13 billion into skills, $9 billion into science and research. That's the story of this government that is committed to getting the country back on track and stabilising the future. And, Mr Deputy Speaker, we saw another example of that today with the release of the 2016 Defence White Paper. While the members opposite sat there and whinging and carping, this government has released a generational plan, a comprehensive and responsible long-term blueprint that will safeguard Australia's national security and will bring with it considerable economic, educational and innovative spin-offs that will drive growth and prosperity. And jobs is right, that's exactly right, the Assistant Minister. And for my electorate of Solomon, the White Paper is a mighty document. This represents decades of government expenditure, billions of dollars in the area of defence alone. It will mean education and training opportunities for kids in Darwin and Palmerston, and indeed the rest of the Northern Territory. It will be a bulwark for small business, and as they plan for the future, it will be jobs for mums and dads. With only 5 minutes time limit, I won't be able to outline all the list of benefits that the Northern Territory will receive, but I'd like to get on record a few. We're going to get around $70 million in additional investment will be spent updating facilities at Robertson Barracks near my hometown of Palmerston in the next 10 years. In the decades of 2025 to 2036, additional investment for up to $800 million will be made for facilities at Robertson Barracks. Around $1.2 billion will be invested in infrastructure upgrades at HMAS Coonawarra and Larrakia Barracks in the decades of 2025 to 2026, with an additional investment of around $2.1 billion. I say again, $2.1 billion towards future long-term facilities requirements in the decades between 2025 and 2036. Investments of around $200 million to airfields and facilities at RAF Base Darwin over the decades 2025 to 2026. Around $5.6 billion in the decade between 2025 and 2036 to enhance airbase capacity in the Northern Territory. Significant investments in new infrastructure and facilities over the next 10 years to support the ADF's strike and air combat capabilities. This includes upgrades to RAF Base Tyndall to support the introduction of the Joint Strike Fighter. Bradshaw Field Training Area will be upgraded to support our land force capabilities, representing an investment of around $20 million in the next 10 years and a further $350 million in the following decade. Defence information networks will be upgraded to provide the capability to store, manage and process large amounts of intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance data. Intelligence capability enhancements will support existing intelligence capabilities based in the Territory. This government will also upgrade and enhance the Jindalee Operation radar network over the next 2 decades, including facilities near Alice Springs. Mr Deputy Speaker, this is just a snapshot of how the Northern Territory will benefit from the Defence White Paper plan that we announced today. It's small to medium enterprises like RGM in Holtz, just outside of Palmerston and only 15 minutes out of Darwin CBD, that will stand to benefit from Australia's Defence Security Plan. This is how the Turnbull government is going to continue to build the Australian economy, despite the efforts of those opposite.
Order. Call the member for Solomon.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And I take this opportunity to add to previous comments that I've made in the House about the Defence White Paper and the enormous impact that it will have on my electorate of Solomon, which takes in the cities of Darwin and Palmerston and has a number of key military facilities, including Robertson Barracks, in it. It's an extremely pragmatic document that outlines in detail Australia's military and strategic requirements, and which recalibrates North Australia as the epicentre of regional engagement into the future. Throughout its epic sweep, however, it keeps a close eye on ensuring that delivery for value for money for taxpayers. Its industry policy statement providing a plan for procurement and delivery that will deliver benefits for the next 2 decades. During the MPI last week, I itemised some of the spending in the Northern Territory that will follow on the back of this white paper. I won't repeat all of those here, Mr Speaker, but I'll summarise it like this. It's $20 billion over the next 20 years. $20 billion being spent in the Northern Territory is just a phenomenal amount, and we're absolutely delighted. This has been extremely well received by industry groups in the Northern Territory, which already has a stake in the Commonwealth's investment in defence in Darwin, Palmerston and right across the top end. The Northern Territory Master Builders Association's Chief Executive David Malone had this to say: As we know, defence has already become an integral component of the Territory's economy for a very long time, and these new commitments flag that it's only going to have an even larger impact. He went on to say that for the construction sector, the White Paper paints a compelling picture, one that will bring a smile to many businesses and the 12,000 plus workers who rely on the industry for a living. The White Paper speaks of multiple projects over multiple years across all facets of construction. By way of background, last year the MBA conducted a study of operational capacity in the Northern Territory, prompted primarily by the imminent conclusion of the INPEX LNG plant construction project that identified, as the report's title suggests, there's capacity to spare. David Malone went on to say, our study first flagged many of these opportunities last year, but confirmation means we are now going to see those plans turn into real investment dollars. And David was here with a number of local businesses a couple of weeks ago, showcasing their Territory's capability in this sector. And I was pleased to be able to meet with them and to push their case, because we have, well, I say no one knows the Territory better than the locals. The Chamber of Commerce, Greg Bicknell, said an investment of $8.2 billion in infrastructure in the coming decade will be a significant boost to the construction industry in the Territory, and that flow-on effects will be felt in the wider community. In addition, he identified that the US force posture initiatives will be worth an estimated $2 to $3 billion over the same period. The White Paper announcement will breathe new confidence into the Northern Territory economy, which has its foundations on the strength of the thousands of small to medium businesses, the majority of which are in Darwin and Palmerston. Many of those small businesses are run by mums and dads whose close connections to their communities have invested their lives in the Territory, and who I come across time and time again in my duties around Solomon. Their kids go to schools in the Territory, they buy homes in the Territory, and their families come up to visit during the dry season to get away from the cold winter weather. These are the cornerstone of the Territory economy, and I'm extremely proud that they will benefit from the Commonwealth's investment from the White Paper. The White Paper will have spin-offs for these businesses, whether it be the owner of the local lunch bar in Winnelly, or the engineering firm in East Arm, or the painters in Parap, or the sheep metal operators in Berrima. And I'll take this opportunity to remind the House that this is the commitment, is in addition to the Commonwealth's promise to grow the Territory through its North Australia investment strategy, which is also many billions of dollars. It will mean jobs and growth in the people on the ground in the Territory, and I'll be working with the community over the coming months to ensure that they're aware of the Coalition's commitment to the Territory.
Members on my left, member for Jagga. The member for Solomon has the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister please outline to the House how rural and regional Australia is successfully transitioning to the new economy?
The Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Solomon for her question. Mr Speaker, ours is a government directing every effort to ensure we continue our successful transition from the mining-led investment boom to broader-based growth driven by services, exports, innovation and technology. The new economy which offers our children and grandchildren the greatest opportunities imaginable, that ensures that in these, the most exciting times for Australians, we are able to seize those great opportunities. Now, Mr Speaker, some of Australia's greatest exports, agriculture, international education, tourism, are spearheading this transition, and they've helped to add more than 300,000 new jobs to our economy over the past year. We've seen strong, through-the-year economic growth of 3% in yesterday's national accounts, and they show how well we are transitioning, how well we are progressing, how much better we're doing than other comparable economies. But we have to use carefully every lever of government, every instrument of policy, to ensure that we make this successful transition. Now, our initiatives include, Mr Speaker, the $1.1 billion innovation agenda. This is working to generate more and better paid jobs. It's serving to encourage investment, to inspire people to have a go and take risks, to inspire entrepreneurship. It's encouraging scientists and technologists to cooperate better with business and industry. And of course, integrally connected to this is the Defence White Paper, which will also spur jobs and growth and investment right across the country and especially in regional Australia. Mr Speaker, local jobs will be generated through a range of projects, from the RAAF base in Amberley in Queensland to work on the Puckapunyal military area in Victoria and upgrades to the Kultana training area and the Woomera Range complex in South Australia. Right around the country, our defence estate will be upgraded. Right around the country, we'll see defence industry contractors getting more work and more opportunities for innovation. Mr Speaker, the innovation is not just about lab research or technology startups. Examples abound of leading-edge technology revolutionising food and fibre production by farm businesses, small and large, across Australia. Mr Speaker, in visiting Queensland recently in Bundaberg, we witnessed Craig Van Ruin, a lychee, avocado and macadamia grower, using drones that looked as though they had stepped out of a science fiction movie to chase away bats and birds and reduce the losses on his crops from 30% to 5%. That's real innovation. Responsible government should.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Seek leave to table a document at the West Australian entitled Federal Government's Plan to Outsource Health Services, Private Medicare.
Is leave granted? Leave is not granted. The member for Solomon has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker.
The member for Solomon has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer please update the House on how the government is supporting the transition from the mining boom to the investment boom to a more diversified economy? Is the Treasurer aware of any threats to this transition, and what impact would higher taxes having on hard-working Australians who are working, saving and investing in our new economy?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Solomon for her question. One of the key issues that the government is focusing on is ensuring the consolidation of our fiscal position, ensuring that the budget remains on that strong path, Mr Speaker, to reduce our expenditure as a share of the economy from 25.9 down to 25.3, which was outlined in the mid-year statement in December of last year, Mr Speaker. And I'm pleased to say today that the Fitch have given their report and the AAA rating of the government has been confirmed. But they do raise an important point, Mr Speaker. They do raise an important point. They say that the outlook is stable, but when they talk about future developments that could result in some change, Mr Speaker, they say that the thing that we should be focused on is ensuring that there is not a sustained widening of the fiscal deficit without remedial policy actions. Now, those on this side of the House, have policy actions, Mr Speaker, to ensure that we remain on that credible and solid path to ensure that we are reducing expenditure as a share of the economy. And the strength of the government's fiscal position is one of great confidence to the economy, Mr Speaker, because we know that consumer sentiment has risen 11% in the last 6 months, that consumer confidence in the economic outlook for the next 12 months is up over 20%. We know that in the employment figures today we have seen the unemployment rate fall to 5.8% in the last 6 months, 114,000 additional jobs, Mr Speaker, a growth rate in employment of 2.1%, and most importantly, Mr Speaker, in the last 6 months, the youth unemployment rate has fallen from 12.8 to 12.2, Mr Speaker. But to ensure that we keep this fiscal consolidation on track, Mr Speaker, the thing you don't do is what those opposite would do if they got control of the Treasury benches. What those opposite want to do, Mr Speaker, is add another $60 billion of expenditure to the government's ticket. That includes $13.4 billion in savings that they refuse to support in this parliament, Mr Speaker. Some $11.4 billion worth of new expenditure that they have announced since the last budget, and some almost $35 billion of expenditure of measures that they are leading the Australian people to suggest that they would reverse if they came into government, Mr Speaker. That's some $60 billion, Mr Speaker, which is equivalent to almost 1% of GDP that those opposite want to put on outlays, Mr Speaker. And you know how they're going to pay for that $60 billion? They've got just over $1 billion in savings, Mr Speaker. They've come up with just over $1 billion in savings, but they do have some taxes, Mr Speaker. They do have some taxes. Those opposite think announcing a tax increase is a substitute for a policy, Mr Speaker. But what it is it's just a tax increase. And some $7 billion in additional taxes is what those opposite are proposing, Mr Speaker. $7 billion. And of course, it includes a 50% increase in capital gains tax on investment, the last thing a transitioning economy needs.
The Treasurer's time has expired.
The question is that the Federation Chamber do now adjourn, and I call the member for Solomon.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I welcome the decision announced yesterday by the Turnbull Government to put the proposed backpackers tax on hold. As you know, Madam Deputy Speaker, I spoke against the tax in the Coalition Party room and made representations to a number of our ministerial colleagues about the impact that the backpacker tax would have on the Northern Territory economy. It is clear that this tax was a significant handbrake not only on the Northern Territory but also on regional and rural Australia. Hospitality, tourism and the primary sector are key industries that employ thousands of people across the Northern Territory, and there was enormous concern that the tax would deter potential workers from coming to the Territory. Over the past few months, I have met with representatives from key industries and passed on their concerns to my coalition colleagues. The government now agrees that further discussions with these vital industries are required to ensure that Australia does not lose the market share in backpacker visitation and that our horticulture sector is able to recruit workers. The Tourism Minister, along with the Minister for Agriculture, Employment, Immigration, Regional Development and Industry, as well as the Treasurer and the Office of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, will now work together to prepare a revenue-neutral proposal. The key issue is to ensure that we have a balanced and equitable approach to the tax status for workers here on visas. And I think it's essential that we continue to put in place the right policy settings that support tourism, support hospitality, support pastoral and the horticultural industries in the Northern Territory economy as we transition out of the mining boom. I will continue to fight for jobs and investment and will always stand up for Territorians because I am the Territory's voice in Canberra, not Canberra's voice in the Territory. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd also like to speak on another issue with the time I have left. I've been contacted by a number of constituents who are worried that they are going to be severely impacted and even go broke because of another Labor plan that they rammed through prior to the last election where they were voted out. Earlier this week, the Road Safety Remuneration Tribunal heard AIG and other peak bodies applications to delay the commencement date of the payments order which applies to independent contractor drivers right across Australia. Given the significance of the structural reforms that were proposed, a reasonable period of time should be allowed for this to be implemented. The tribunal, after hearing the various parties, including the Commonwealth, made the following orders: that the tribunal has published a draft amended order which adopts a new commencement date of the 1st of January 2017 and that the transitional provisions proposed by AIG. Secondly, that interested parties have until midday on Monday the 21st of March 2016 to comment on the draft amended order. Thirdly, that interested parties can comment on each other's submissions until the 24th of March 2016. The matter will come back before the tribunal on the 24th of March, and at that time the tribunal will decide whether it will conduct a further hearing to hear from interested parties in person from the 26th to the 28th of March. Now, having However, despite this development, the Tribunal has not yet changed the commencement date of the 4th of April 2016. So I say to all the people who contacted me about this issue, you have until midday on the 21st of March to make your submissions and specifically comment on the new commencement date. Don't assume that just because you have already made a submission previously that that submission will be considered by the Tribunal. New submissions specifically talking about the draft amended date must be submitted, and because the draft amended order published this week must be lodged by the 21st of March if they are going to be considered to the Tribunal. So I will repeat again, you must make a new submission talking about the new commencement date so that the Tribunal can consider that. Do not assume that your previous submissions will be taken into consideration for the dates.
I
it
thank
is
the
very
member
important.
for Solomon.
Call the member for Solomon.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. And it's a pleasure to follow my colleague, the member for Hughes. This legislation is about jobs for the future. It's about the 21st century economy. It's about ensuring Australia is competitive on a global scale and that we have a broad base from which to build our national wealth. The Australian economy is fundamentally strong. Unemployment is relatively low. The surplus left by the previous coalition government shielded us from the worst effects of the global financial crisis, and there is a sense overall that the nation is on the right track. But governments should not, and this government won't rest on its laurels. What the Turnbull government wants to do is to ensure that the foundation stones for change are laid now, that the frameworks for business and industry to prosper into the future are put into place now. The successful transition of the Australian economy from the resources-led boom will be fuelled by innovation, by investment in a more diverse range of industries and support for businesses to create more jobs. We've announced important building blocks in our economic plan to support this transition, including the innovation and science agenda, which will develop the skills required for the jobs of the future and bring more great Australian ideas to the market and to support startups. Mr Deputy Speaker, I see a very different Australia in the next few decades, one that is still reliant on our natural resources, but it is also more attuned to the needs of the regions and beyond. In the same way that the United States economy has benefited from the genius that is Apple and Microsoft and so on, so too can Australia lead the world in innovation and technology. In the United States, one of the fascinating stories is the rise up of Tesla Motors, in part because of its charismatic founder and CEO, Elon Musk, but also the drive for innovation that has been central to its development over the past decade and a half. Tesla first gained the public's interest following the release of the Tesla Roadster, the world's first fully electric sports car, back in around 2008. It was the first electric vehicle to have a range in excess of 300 kilometres between charges, and thanks to the innovative lithium battery cells. Between 2008 and 2012, it sold about 2,500 models, but concurrently with that in 2009, Tesla released the Model S all-electric sedan, which by the end of last year had sold 100,000 models worldwide. In March, the company unveiled the Tesla Model 3, the first vehicle aimed at the mass market, and within weeks, global reservations totalled around 350,000 units, representing a potential sales figure exceeding $14 billion. For America, the success of Tesla Motors is not just defined by the advance orders. Tesla is one of the new economy industries that has been able to create jobs by the thousand. In December 2012, Tesla employed almost 3,000 staff. 3 years later, that figure had increased to more than 13,000, a rise of more than 10,000 jobs in just over 3 years. And through the drive and determination of the Tesla team and its charismatic driving force of Elon Musk, Tesla has been able to create a low-emissions vehicle that is expected to one day be affordable to the average wage earner. The Model 3 is estimated to cost around $35,000 in US terms, which might still put it out of the reach of some Australian families just at the moment. But through innovation and development, the organisation has been able to substantially reduce the cost of purchasing a low-emissions vehicle in the United States and elsewhere. While it hasn't all been smooth sailing with Tesla, there have been some legal issues around copyright and patents that have dragged the company through the courts. And then there was a particularly famous episode of Jeremy Clarkson's Top Gear where the crew were filming pushing a Tesla into a garage, presumably after its batteries had run out. But overall, the company has defied the odds to deliver long-range electric vehicles, which has been promised for years, but until recently remained a pipeline dream. So this is what I referred to earlier when I mentioned Australia being more attuned to the needs of the region and beyond. With the many great minds we have at our universities and research institutes across the country, I have no doubt that one of the areas of innovation where Australia will lead the way will be in the development of sustainable technologies and green energies that will meet the demand in the Asia-Pacific region and in the Northern Hemisphere as well. But of course the scope is endless, and this legislation that we're discussing today will help facilitate innovation and smart thinking for years and decades to come in this country. In the process, it will mean new jobs, more export dollars and more investment. So to the legislation, the two key headline items for this package of amendments were very appropriately and I think accurately summarised in the March edition of Tax Month. Their appraisal focused on the 20% tax offset on investments of up to $200,000 in innovation and the 10-year capital gains tax exemption. The Tax Law Amendment Tax Incentives for Innovation Bill 2016 was introduced into the House of Reps by the Treasurer Scott Morrison in March and proposed the following amendments. Early stage innovation company amendments to the Income Tax Assessment Act of 1997 are intended to encourage new investment in Australia early stage innovation companies with high growth potential by providing investors who invest in such companies with tax incentives. These amendments form part of the tax incentives for early stage investors. Tax incentives to encourage innovation via these entities include a 20% carry-forward non-refundable offset on investment capped at $200,000 per year. The tax offset will be available upon investment, not when the funds are used by the innovation company. There will also be a 10-year exemption on capital gains tax for investments held in the form of shares in the innovation company for at least 12 months, provided that the shares held do not constitute more than 30% interest in the innovation company and that any sale of the shares will be taxed on a deemed capital accounts basis. To qualify for these incentives, the investments must be in an early stage investment company, broadly unlisted, less than 3 years old, $220,000 or less accessible income in the previous year, and $1 million or less in total expenses in the previous year. There are no investment limits on sophisticated investors under Section 708 of the Corporations Act of 2001, except for the $220,000 investment limit for the tax offset. Other investors will have a $50,000 limit. These amendments will apply in relation to shares issued on or after the later of the 1st of July 2016 or on royal assent. The early stage venture capital limited partnership, otherwise known as the ESVCLP, and venture capital limited partnerships, the VCLP, regimes within the Venture Capital Act of 2002 and the ITA 1997 will be amended to improve access to venture capital investments and make the regimes more attractive to investors. The amendments provided on additional tax incentives for the limited partners in the new ESVCLPs, relax restrictions on the ESVCLP investments and fund size, and clarify the legal framework for venture capital investment in Australia. Under the changes, there would be a non-refundable tax offset of 10% of the value of new capital invested into early-stage venture capital limited partnerships during the income year. An increase in the maximum fund size of early-stage venture capital limited partnerships from $100 million to $200 million. The improved access to funding from managed investment trusts, and also broadening and simplifying rules for both venture capital limited partnerships and early-stage venture capital limited partnerships. These amendments will broadly apply on or after the 1st of July 2016. However, the ESVCLP tax offsets will be available for any qualifying contributions made to the ESVCLP that became unconditionally registered on or after 7th of December 2015, which was the date that the measure was announced in the Prime Minister's Innovation Statement. By way of definition, the explanatory memorandum answers the question, what is early stage investment company ESIC? Generally, an Australian incorporated company will qualify as an ESIC if it's an early stage of its development and it is developing new or significantly improved innovations with the purpose of commercialisation to generate an economic return, and the specific objectives threshold tests apply to determine if the company is at early stage of its development, whereas a combination of tests may apply to determine if the company is developing a type of innovation. These different tests recognise that while objective tests are easy to apply to Australia's self-assessment income tax, companies may be innovating in a variety of different ways and so may need to apply a combination of different tests depending on their circumstances. The early stage limb, a company must pass 4 tests to satisfy the early stage limb of the qualifying ESIC test. Test 1, whereas the company has been recently incorporated or registered to the Australian Business Register, the company must have incorporated in Australia within the last 3 years. Incorporated within the last 3 years. It has not been incorporated within the last 3 income years, then it must have been registered in the Australian Business Register within the last 3 income years. If it's not been registered in the ABR within the last 3 income years, then it must have been incorporated in Australia within the last 6 income years. And it will wholly owned subsidiaries must incur expenses of no more than $1 million in total across all of the last 3 income years. Now, the ATO's company tax return requires companies to report total expenses as part of the total profit or loss calculation. A company that has submitted a company tax return in the previous income year must rely on the amount reported on item 6 for the purpose of this test. So alternatively, if the company was not required to submit a company tax return, it may use the amount corresponding to this item. A company that does not meet any of these requirements will not qualify as an ESIC. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, I commend the Treasurer on his work in putting this piece of legislation together. It's, as I said at the beginning of my comments, that this legislation is all about jobs for the future. It's about the 21st century economy. It's about ensuring Australia is competitive on a global scale, and I'm really pleased to have been able to speak on it, and I commend the bill to the House.
The question is, The bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Solomon.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I rise to speak on the Financial Systems Legislation Amendment, Resilience and Collateral Protection Bill 2016. At the 2009 Group of 20, or the G20 as it's better known, in the Pittsburgh Summit, the Australian Government joined other jurisdictions in committing to substantial reforms to practices in over-the-counter or OTC derivative markets. According to the Australian Securities and Investment Commission website, 3 of the key G20 commitments for OTC derivatives were the reporting of all OTC derivative transactions and trade to trade repositories, clearing of all standardised OTC derivatives through central counterparts, and thirdly, execution of standardised OTC derivatives on exchange or electronic trading platforms where appropriate. The overarching objective of the OTC derivative reforms are to firstly enhance the transparency of transaction information available to relevant authorities and the public, secondly, to promote financial stability, and thirdly, support the detection and prevention of market abuse. These commitments aim to bring transparency to markets and improve risk management practices. These changes provide a framework for the regulation of OTC derivatives reporting, clearing and trade execution. The legislation forms part of Australia's response to the 2009 G20 commitments, as I said. By way of background, derivatives is a security instrument whose price is dependent upon or derived from underlying assets such as stock, bonds, commodities, currencies, interest rates and market indexes. Derivative products have traditionally been traded through bilateral agreements between parties or over-the-counter, which is the OTC, and not through a central clearing exchange like a stock exchange or trading platform. Leading up to the 2008 global financial crisis, there was a lack of transparency concerning the risk profile of participants and the value of their transactions. The Australian legislative framework to implement these reforms commenced in January 2013 when the new Part 7(5)(a) of the Corporations Act of 2001 became effective. Under Part 75(a), the Minister has the power to prescribe certain classes of derivatives as being subject to an ASIC rulemaking power for mandatory transaction reporting to a derivative trade repository, mandatory clearing by a central counterparty or mandatory execution on a trading platform. A decision by the Minister prescribing a class of derivatives under the framework will be based on advice from the Council of Financial Regulations, or the CFR, which is comprised of ASIC, the Reserve Bank of Australia and the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority. ASIC has responsibility for implementing derivative transaction rules and derivative trade repository rules in Australia as part of Australia's G20 OTC derivative commitments. In general, the reason for which a stock is traded over the counter is usually because the company is small, making it unable to meet exchange listing requirements. Also known as unlisted stock, these securities are traded by broker-dealers who negotiate directly with one another over computer networks or by phone. But small companies may not always remain small, and the power of over-the-counter trading should never be underestimated. The United States retail giant Walmart was founded in 1962 and began trading over-the-counter stocks. By 1969, Walmart was incorporated, and in 1972, with stores in 5 American states, Walmart had earned over $1 billion US in sales, the fastest company to ever accomplish this, and was listed on the New York Stock Exchange. Experts believe the role of over-the-counters in contributing to the 2008 global financial crisis was hidden because the more profile real estate bubble which spectacularly burst in the United States and elsewhere. In 2010, online magazine Business Australia stated that although media attention continues to focus on the political theme of economic recovery and residential real estate, the true cause of what came to be known as the credit crisis continues unabated outside the purview of the central banks and governments. Business Australia's analysis of the wrecking ball's capacity of OTCs, if not properly regulated, paints a sobering picture, saying derivatives on different underlying assets are traded in the absence of clearinghouses, i.e. in unregulated markets. Since they are not exchange-traded derivatives, they are not widely understood. In over-the-counter markets, counterparty default risks generate a network of independencies among market actors and promotes risk volatility. The result to the financial system is systematic risk, which became apparent in 2008 when Lehman Brothers failed. Officially, roughly $604.6 trillion in OTC derivative contracts, more than 10 times the world GDP, which in 2010 was $57.53 trillion, hang over the financial world, but to the average investor, the derivative bubbles is invisible. From the perspective of the outside, the bubble, the explosion of OTC derivatives is a mania. Business Australia contends that the inherent lack of transparency in OTC markets impairs price discovery and undermines the contention that financial instruments are always priced correctly. It therefore follows that OTC derivatives and the risks associated with them may be priced incorrectly. In response to requests by the Australian Government to ascertain how its G20 commitments might best be implemented, the CFR developed an extensive report which concluded the volumes and types of OTC derivative transactions undertaken in Australia are small by global standards, comprising of only 2% of global notional turnover. Further, as is the case in most countries, participants in the Australian-located OTC derivative markets undertake a large amount of cross-border activity. The CFR report states that financial institutions use a wide variety of derivatives in the Australian market, and some participants use single currency interest rate derivatives to hedge interest rate risks, while others use a range of single and cross-currency derivatives, foreign exchange derivatives and credit card derivatives to manage exposures. Corporates use derivatives covering single and cross-country or cross-currency interest rates, FX and commodity derivatives. So in response to the G20 agreement and the GFC, many other industrialised countries, including the United Kingdom and other members of the European Union, have enacted similar legislation to clarify these or their security laws to provide for rapid and non-formalistic enforcement procedures in order to safeguard financial stability and limit effects in case of default of a party to certain financial market contracts. So in doing so, they both reduce possible risks for parties to certain contracts in respect of which margin is provided and remove impediments to the international competitiveness of the local financial institutions. So, for example, these reforms will reduce the risk that a secured party which has been based its evaluation of its counterparty credit risk on the expectations that its exposures were appropriately secured actually loses priority to other parties on the counterparty's default. This bill amends 6 existing pieces of legislation: the Payment System and Netting Act of 1998, the Banking Act of 1959, the Financial Sector Business Transfer and Group Restructure Act of 1998, the Insurance Act of 1973, the Life Insurance Act of 1995, and finally the Private Health Insurance Prudential Supervision Act of 2015. The bill will create a more resilient and stable financial system and allow our financial institutions to continue to be effective participants in an international market. The bill delivers on the government's commitment in response to the financial system inquiry to clarify domestic regulation to support globally coordinated policy efforts and facilitate the ongoing participation of Australian entities in international capital markets. The bill also delivers on Australia's commitment as part of the G20 to address systematic risks associated with the over-the-counter derivative markets post-GST. It complements the GFC. It complements a series of reforms already in place that make these markets more transparent and more accountable. It also creates a regime which will allow financial institutions in Australia to meet international OTC derivative margining requirements, which are due to be phased in from the 1st of September 2016, and any corresponding prudential standards set by the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, or APRA. As well, it also resolves other issues of concern to regulators and industry participants in Australian financial markets. For example, this bill strengthens the protection of certain payment systems, settlement systems, exchange and central counterparties in all market conditions. It has been developed in careful consultation with APRA, the Reserve Bank, ASIC and the industry stakeholders. Stakeholders have been broadly supportive of the reform and recognise the considerable cost to business of maintaining the status quo. The bill will allow Australia to maintain its position as a regional financial centre with a strong regulatory and legislative framework. Some of the reforms set out in the bill adopt similar concepts to those used, as I said, in other developed countries. And it's really good to see that Labor are supporting this legislation. So with that, Mr Deputy Speaker, I will commend the bill to the House.
I call the member for Solomon.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I rise reflecting on my favourite paper, the Northern Territory's News Fair Go campaign, where they were making a very strong case for a fair go by government for regional Australia. It looked at many aspects of life in the Territory, from education to aged care, from roads to hospitals, from life expectancy to cost of living, highlighting the challenges of living in regional and remote Australia when stacked against the major southern cities, especially Melbourne and Sydney. So growing up in Alice Springs and attending university in Darwin, where I raised a family and worked in the private and public sector, I think I'm pretty well qualified to discuss life in the regions. While acknowledging the political, economic and social priorities associated with funding the major cities, I believe governments over many years have held back national economic growth through their abject failure to properly fund infrastructure and services in remote part of the countries. The Territory is experiencing a period of negative net interstate migration. While a number of factors are at play, how much is it to do with the lack of specialist medical services, or the disparity of educational outcomes, or the higher cost of living that comes with living in the north? Our beef industry is a case in point, where the road cattle producers need to travel before they reach out of their major highway to deliver the livestock are in some cases no better than dirt roads. This stifles productivity growth and holds back further gains in one of the Territory's most productive industries. It makes a great deal of sense to develop the infrastructure, say, for example, better beef roads to facilitate growth in the industry around the investment than waiting for the industry to grow and then following up with the investment. So let's not forget that Victoria and New South Wales benefit from gold discoveries that helped them establish their economies 170 years ago. I'm proud to be a member of a government that has an eye on regional growth through the $5 billion North Australia Investment Facility, the billions of dollars that have been committed under the Defence White Paper and the North Australian Development Paper. It has never been a better time to be a Territorian. I would like to just finish by saying congratulations to Matt Williams, who is the new Northern Territory news editor, and I'm sure he's going to do a great job. And I would also like to congratulate Rachel Hancock on the extraordinary job that she has done as our first ever female editor, and I wish her all the very best in her new role in Brisbane.